wind in the Wyoming Territory did not simply blow, it hunted. It scoured the high plains with a relentless, invisible hand, searching for cracks in the chinking of log cabins and gaps in the collars of heavy wool coats. It stripped the soil from the earth and carried it in stinging sheets across a landscape that seemed too vast for any human heart to fill. In the shadow of the distant, saw-toothed mountains, the town of Dry Creek clung to the earth like a barnacle on the hull of a weathered ship. It was a place of gray boards and gray dust, where the only color came from the fading painted letters on the false front of the saloon and the rusty red of the blacksmith's shed. Dry Creek was not a town that welcomed strangers, nor was it kind to its own. Dust devils spun down the main rutted thoroughfare, dancing between the legs of gaunt cattle that huddled against the hitching rails, their heads low against the gale. The sound of the town was a constant, low-pitched moan, the ache of wind pressing against loose boards, the rattle of tin roofs, and the rhythmic creak of the sign above the livery stable swaying back and forth. Counting time in a place that seemed forgotten by the rest of the country. Miles from the cluster of buildings, out where the sagebrush rolled endlessly toward the horizon. Margaret Hayes fought her daily war against the land. Everyone called her Maggie, though lately few called her anything at all to her face. Maggie stood in the yard of her isolated homestead, the weight of a splitting axe dragging at her shoulders. She was 28 years old, though the sun and the wind had etched fine lines at the corners of her eyes that made her look older. Her hands, wrapped in rough leather gloves, were trembling from exertion. A pile of pine logs lay before her, stubborn and knotted, refusing to yield easily to the blade. She swung the axe. The steel bit into the wood with a dull thud, jarring her bones, but the log did not split. She wrenched the blade free and swung again, a grunt of effort escaping her throat. This time the wood cracked, falling into two halves. She did not stop to rest. In this country, stopping meant freezing, or starving, or simply letting the silence become loud enough to scream at. Her life was a cycle of hard, repetitive labor. After the wood was stacked against the side of the cabin, she took 2 tin buckets down to the creek. The water was low, locked beneath a crust of jagged ice. Maggie had to break the surface with a stone before she could dip the buckets, the freezing water splashing onto her skirts and instantly turning stiff in the biting air. She hauled the water back up the slope, her boots slipping on the frozen mud, her breath pluming before her face like smoke. The cabin itself was small, built of rough-hewn timber that had weathered to the color of iron. The roof leaked in 3 places when the spring rains came, and Maggie spent hours patching it with tar and canvas, fighting a losing battle against rot. A small garden patch sat fenced off to the side, though now it was nothing but frozen stalks and rocks. She had tried to grow vegetables there, coaxing life from the alkaline soil, but the frost always seemed to come early, or the deer would jump the fence, or the hail would beat the tender shoots into the mud. Inside the cabin, the air was still and smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. It was a tidy space, scrubbed clean with a desperation that bordered on madness. But it was the details of the room that told the true story of Maggie Hayes. By the door, a pair of men's work boots sat stiff and dusty. They had not moved in 8 months. Above the stone fireplace, a heavy Sharps rifle hung on 2 iron pegs, its barrel gleaming with oil Maggie applied faithfully every Sunday. In the corner stood a cedar chest, and inside it, folded with sharp precision, was a black mourning dress. She never wore it. To the town, her refusal to wear black was a sign of disrespect, a confirmation of her cold heart. To Maggie, it was a refusal to mourn a man who had made her life a prison. Her husband, Frank, had been a hard man, a rancher who believed that fear was the only way to command respect from horses, dogs, and wives. He had died in the barn, kicked in the temple by a stallion he had been beating with a whip. The town called it a tragedy. Maggie called it the first quiet night she had known in 5 years. But peace had a price. Later that morning, Maggie hitched her mare, a stubborn sorrel named Nutmeg, to the small buckboard wagon. She needed supplies, flour, coffee, and nails to fix the corral fence. The drive to town took an hour, the wagon wheels grinding loudly over the hard-packed earth. When she rolled into Dry Creek, the atmosphere shifted. Men loitering on the boardwalk stopped their conversation to watch her pass. They did not tip their hats. Their eyes were hard, assessing, stripping away her dignity layer by layer. Women walking arm in arm pulled their shawls tighter and turned their heads, whispering behind gloved hands. Maggie kept her chin high, staring straight ahead at the ears of her horse. She tied Nutmeg to the rail outside the general store and smoothed her skirt before stepping inside. A bell chimed above the door, a cheerful sound that withered in the sudden silence of the room. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, was measuring out sugar for Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife. As soon as Maggie entered, Mrs. Gable stiffened. She took her package, threw a sharp glance at Maggie, and swept out of the store without a word. Maggie approached the counter, placing her list on the wood. "I need these items. Please, Mr. Henderson." And a small keg of nails. The storekeeper did not smile. He read the list slowly, licking his thumb to turn the page of his ledger. "That will be $4.50. Mrs. Hayes, prices have gone up on account of the freight costs." Maggie knew the prices hadn't gone up that much, but she said nothing. She counted out the coins from a small leather purse. The money was running low. Frank hadn't left much, and the cattle he had owned were slowly being sold off just to keep her fed. As she waited for her goods, she heard the whisper of two men standing near the potbelly stove in the corner. "Died in strange circumstances, didn't he?" one man muttered, his voice low but meant to be heard. "Brought it on herself," the other replied, spitting tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "A woman like that, living out there alone? Unnatural. Hell, I heard she didn't even cry at the funeral." Maggie's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She focused on the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the window, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She took her supplies and walked out, the heavy sack of flour in her arms acting as a shield against the town's judgment. As she struggled to load the wagon, a shadow fell over her. She turned to see Reverend Harlan standing there. He was a tall man with a face like a hatchet, sharp and severe. He wore a long black coat that flapped around his ankles in the wind. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice smooth and carrying a tone of practiced concern. "Reverend," Maggie replied, nodding once. "I noticed you were not at service last Sunday," he said, clasping his hands behind his back. "The roads were bad," Maggie lied. Harlan stepped closer, invading her personal space just enough to make her uncomfortable. "The town worries about you. Margaret, a woman alone on that ranch. It is not proper. It tempts trouble. It tempts weak men's eyes and invites sin." Maggie stiffened. "I can look after myself. Reverend, I have done so for months." Harlan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Pride is a dangerous thing. I have spoken to some of the council. We believe it would be best if you sold the land. There are buyers interested. You could move east, back to your people. Start over where the shadow of your husband's death does not linger." "This is my home," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "I am not selling." Harlan sighed, as if dealing with a petulant child. "Stubbornness will not protect you when the wolves come. Mrs. Hayes, be they four-legged or two-legged." He tipped his hat, the gesture devoid of any real respect, and walked away. Maggie watched him go, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. From the other side of the street, on the raised boardwalk of the hotel, another man watched her. Silas Boone was everything Frank Hayes had wanted to be: wealthy, powerful, and ruthless. He owned half the valley, and his cattle grazed on thousands of acres of open range. He was a large man, dressed in a suit of fine wool, a diamond stick pin glinting in his cravat. He leaned against the railing, smoking a cigar, his eyes tracking Maggie's movements with predatory focus. He turned to the man beside him, a nervous-looking clerk. "That is the Hayes widow?" Boone asked, smoke curling from his lips. "Yes, Mr. Boone," That's her, and the land, specifically the creek access, the clerk noted. If the railroad surveyors are correct about the grade, they will need that water crossing. The track will have to go right through her south pasture. Boone nodded slowly, ash falling from his cigar. A lone woman has no business sitting on a gold mine she doesn't understand. It is a waste. He looked back at Maggie, who was climbing onto her wagon seat, her posture rigid. She's a handsome woman, Boone murmured, more to himself than the clerk. Too much fire, though. Someone needs to teach her that fire burns down houses if it is intended to. Maggie snapped the reins, urging Nutmeg into a trot. She wanted to be away from the eyes, the whispers, and the suffocating judgment of Dry Creek. She wanted the empty silence of the plains, even if that silence was lonely enough to break her heart. The ride home began under a pale, watery sun. But the Wyoming sky was a fickle thing. By the time Maggie was 3 miles out of town, the wind had changed. It stopped its steady moan and began to shriek. To the west, a wall of darkness was rising from the earth. It wasn't rain. It was solid brown, a towering bruise against the horizon, a dust storm. Maggie cursed under her breath and slapped the reins against the mare's rump. "Yeah, get on! Nutmeg!" The horse tossed her head, sensing the drop in pressure. The air turned distinctively metallic, tasting of copper and dry earth. The wall of dust moved with terrifying speed, swallowing the mountains, then the foothills, and finally the sun itself. One moment, it was afternoon. The next, it was a choking twilight. The dust hit them like a physical blow. It wasn't just air. It was grit, sand, and small stones, blasting against Maggie's skin and stinging her eyes. She pulled her scarf up over her nose and mouth, squinting against the onslaught. The world shrank to the space between the wagon wheels and the horse's ears. Nutmeg panicked. The mare whinnied, a high-pitched sound of terror, and danced sideways, fighting the traces. "Easy," Maggie shouted, her voice lost in the roar of the wind. "Easy, girl!" The wagon lurched violently as the wheels hit a dry rut. Maggie gripped the bench with white knuckles, blinded by the swirling brown chaos. She didn't see the dry wash until the mare was right on top of it. Nutmeg balked, rearing up. The sudden stop threw Maggie forward. She scrambled to hold on, but the wagon tipped dangerously on the uneven ground. She was seconds away from being thrown beneath the wheels and dragged. Suddenly, a shape materialized out of the brown haze. It was a horse and rider, cutting across her path. The stranger rode a large, dark bay gelding that seemed to cleave through the wind. The rider didn't hesitate. He spurred his mount forward, leaning low in the saddle, with a fluid, practiced motion. The man reached out and grabbed Nutmeg's bridle near the bit. He used his own horse's weight to force the mare away from the edge of the wash, steadying the panicked animal with brute strength and calm hands. "Whoa, steady now." A voice came through the storm. It wasn't a shout, but a deep, resonant baritone that somehow cut under the howl of the wind. "Easy, Mama, you are all right." The wagon slammed back down onto all 4 wheels. Maggie gasped, clutching her chest, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. The stranger guided both horses toward the shelter of a rocky outcrop, a massive slab of sandstone that jutted from the earth like a broken tooth. It offered a small pocket of relief from the biting wind. Maggie wiped the dust from her eyes, looking up at her savior. He was a tall man, lean but broad at the shoulders. He wore a canvas duster that had seen better years, the hem frayed and stained with trail mud. His hat was pulled low, the brim battered, but beneath it, she saw a pair of tired, watchful eyes the color of flint. He had a few days' growth of beard, dark and rough, and a thin white scar that ran along his jawline, disappearing into his collar. He dismounted slowly, checking his own horse before walking back to the wagon. He moved with a stiffness that spoke of long days in the saddle, yet there was a grace to it, a careful economy of motion. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" he asked. He stood near the wheel, close enough to be heard but far enough back to show he meant no harm. Maggie swallowed, trying to find her voice. No, I am not hurt, just shaken. My horse spooked. She barely missed the drop-off." he said, nodding toward the wash that was now hidden in the swirling dust. You got lucky. I know, Maggie said, her defenses rising instantly. She wasn't used to men helping her without a lecture attached. I could have handled it. The cowboy looked at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't mock her. He didn't smile. He just nodded again. I reckon you could have, but 2 hands are better than 1 in a blow like this. He reached up, offering a hand to help her down. We best wait it out here. These storms can blind a horse in 5 minutes. If you keep moving, you will end up halfway to Montana before you know you are lost. Maggie looked at his gloved hand. It was large, leather-worn, and steady. She hesitated, remembering Reverend Harlan's warnings about wolves, remembering the cruelty of men. But the wind was screaming around the rocks, and the wagon was exposed. She took his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, pulling her down from the seat with surprising ease. He didn't linger. As soon as her boots touched the ground, he let go and stepped back, turning his attention to soothing Nutmeg. I am Luke, he said, stroking the mare's neck. Luke called her. Maggie Hayes. She replied, wrapping her shawl tighter around herself. She stood with her back against the sandstone, watching him. He was different from the men in town. He didn't look at her with hunger, or judgment, or pity. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence line, assessing the situation, checking for breaks, but keeping his thoughts to himself. You are passing through? She asked, shouting slightly over the wind. Just looking for work, Luke said. He pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and offered it to her. Honest work, ranching, breaking horses, whatever pays. Maggie took the canteen. The water was lukewarm and tasted of tin, but it washed the grit from her throat. Thank you. There is not much work in Dry Creek, unless you want to work for Silas Boone, and he only hires men who don't ask questions. Luke's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He took the canteen back and took a sip. I have worked for men like that before. I am not looking to do it again. He capped the canteen and looked out at the brown void beyond their shelter. Maggie watched him. She noticed the way he stood, balanced on the balls of his feet, his right hand never drifting far from the worn walnut grip of the Colt revolver on his hip. He was a man who expected trouble. The scar on his jaw was old, a jagged line of white against his tanned skin. It looked like a knife wound. You have calluses, Luke said suddenly, breaking the silence. Maggie blinked, self-consciously tucking her hands into the folds of her skirt. What? On your hands, he said, nodding toward where she had gripped the reins. When I helped you down, you have calluses like a man who works a claim. You run a place by yourself. I do, Maggie said defensively. Since my husband passed, I did not mean any offense, Luke said softly. It takes a strong woman to hold ground out here. The land tries to kill you every chance it gets. Most people tell me I should give up, Maggie said, surprising herself with her honesty. They say I am foolish. Luke turned to look at her fully. His eyes were intense, stripping away the pretense. Most people are scared of what they can't control. A woman who can stand on her own. That scares them more than anything. The wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound. But for a moment, the space between them felt quiet. Maggie felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling of being seen, not as a widow, not as a victim, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person. Luke looked away first, tipping his hat brim down. Storm is breaking. I can see the ridgeline again. He was right. The brown curtain was thinning, revealing the ghostly shapes of the sagebrush. They waited another 10 minutes until the air cleared enough to travel safely. Luke checked the harness on her wagon, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. I will ride with you a ways, he said, just to make sure the mare doesn't spook again. He didn't ask for permission. He just mounted his horse and waited. Maggie climbed back onto the wagon seat. They traveled in silence, the cowboy riding alongside her wagon. He kept his distance, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert for rattlesnakes or washouts. When her cabin came into view, a small, dark shape against the vast emptiness, Luke pulled his horse up. "This is your turn," he said. "Yes," Maggie said. She held the reins tight. You could come in for coffee? As a thank you." Luke looked at the cabin, then back at her. He seemed to consider it, a flicker of longing crossing his face, quickly replaced by the mask of the drifter. "Best I don't, Mrs. Hayes. Folks in town talk enough as it is. You don't need them seeing a stranger's horse at your rail." Maggie felt a sharp pang of disappointment, followed by shame. He was right. "Thank you, Mr. Calder," she said formally, "for saving me." Luke touched the brim of his hat. 2 fingers, a simple salute. "You take care, Maggie." He turned his horse and rode toward town. He didn't look back. Maggie sat in the wagon, the wind tugging at her bonnet, watching him until he was just a speck in the distance. She felt a phantom warmth on her hand where he had touched her, a ghost of connection that frightened her more than the storm had. That night, the wind returned with a vengeance. It rattled the glass in the window panes and whistled down the chimney, making the flames in the hearth dance wildly. Maggie sat in a rocking chair, a quilt pulled up to her chin. The cabin was silent except for the wind. Across from her sat the empty armchair, Frank's chair. For years, she had sat in this spot, her body tense, waiting for his drunken stumble on the porch steps, waiting for the shout, the accusation, the backhand that would send her sprawling. The fear had been a constant companion, a cold stone in her gut. Now, the fear was gone, replaced by a hollow, aching void. She looked at the fire. She thought of Luke Calder's eyes, tired eyes, eyes that had seen pain. He had spoken to her with kindness, just simple kindness. It shouldn't have mattered so much. It shouldn't have made her want to weep. But it did. She stood up, blowing out the lantern. The darkness rushed in, absolute and heavy. Maggie climbed into her cold bed, pulling the heavy wool blankets over her head. Outside, far out on the black prairie, a coyote howled. It was joined by another, a chorus of yips and cries rising up to the starless sky. It was the sound of the wild, the sound of things that hunted and things that were hunted. Maggie lay awake, her eyes wide in the dark. She pressed her hand against her heart, feeling its slow, steady beat. The loneliness pressed down on her, a physical weight. It wasn't just the silence of the room, it was the silence of her life. Day after day of struggle, with no one to share the burden, no one to whisper a soft word when the night was long. She thought of the cowboy riding away. She thought of the way he had said her name. "I can't do this forever," she whispered to the empty room. The wind howled back, offering no comfort, only the endless, indifferent cold of the Wyoming night. Maggie closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like to not be alone, and that hope, fragile and dangerous, hurt more than the solitude ever had. The Bar S Ranch sprawled across the valley floor like a scar on the land, a testament to the ambition of Silas Boone. It was a place of hard angles and harder men where the fences were strung tight enough to sing in the wind and the cattle were branded with a searing heat that smelled of burnt hair and terrified animal flesh. Luke Calder had been working at the Bar S for 6 days, and his body was beginning to remember the brutal rhythm of ranch work. He spent his mornings in the breaking corral, a circular pen of high pine poles where wild mustangs were turned into working stock. It was violent, dusty work. The horses Boone bought were green-broke at best, wild at worst. Animals with eyes that rolled white with panic and hooves that struck out with lethal precision. Luke stood in the center of the corral, holding a lead rope attached to a sweat-slicked roan. The dust hung in the air, coating his throat and stinging his eyes. The horse reared, screaming its frustration, pawing at the sky. Luke didn't flinch. He didn't yell. He simply held his ground, anchoring the rope against his hip, waiting for the animal to exhaust its fury. He knew that breaking a horse wasn't about breaking its spirit. It was about convincing the animal that trusting him was the only way to find peace. Silas Boone watched from the top rail of the fence, his boots polished to a shine that offended the dust around him. He smoked a cigar, the ash falling onto the dirt below. "Make him submit." "Calder," Boone called out, his voice carrying a lazy authority. "Don't coddle him. I need that horse ready for the line camp by Tuesday. If he won't take a saddle, put a spade bit in his mouth and tear the fight out of him." Luke ignored the advice. He kept his eyes on the horse, speaking in a low, rhythmic murmur that only the animal could hear. "Easy, easy now. You are all right." He waited until the roan dropped its head, blowing hard through flared nostrils, before he moved. He approached slowly, running a gloved hand down the animal's trembling neck. It took another hour, but by noon, the horse accepted the weight of the saddle without bucking. When Luke walked out of the corral, dusting his hat against his leg, Boone was waiting. "You take too long," Boone said, looking at his pocket watch. "Time is money. Calder, a ruined horse is worth no money at all." "Mr. Boone," Luke replied, his voice flat. "You break his spirit with pain. He will fail you when you need him most. He will quit on you in a blizzard or throw you when a wolf howls. You treat him fair. He will ride until his heart bursts for you." Boone chuckled, a dry sound like dry leaves skittering on stone. "You have a lot of opinions for a drifter earning $30 a month. Just do the job. I don't pay you to be a philosopher. I pay you because you can ride anything with 4 legs." Luke watched the cattleman walk away toward the main house. He saw the way the other ranch hands stepped aside for Boone, eyes downcast. It wasn't respect, it was fear. Boone ran his ranch the way a tyrant ran a kingdom, extracting every ounce of value from man and beast until they were used up, then discarding them without a backward glance. That night, the bunkhouse was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and damp wool drying by the cast-iron stove. The wind outside battered the walls, searching for a way in. The men sat on their bunks or played cards at a scarred table in the center of the room. They were a rough lot, men who had drifted north from Texas or west from the Kansas feedlots, carrying their pasts in saddlebags and silence. Luke sat on his bunk, mending a tear in his stirrup leather with an awl and waxed thread. He kept to himself, eating his beans in silence and listening to the rise and fall of conversation. "Say, new man," a voice cut through the quiet. Luke didn't look up, pushing the needle through the tough leather. The speaker was a young, cocky hand named Jory, a boy who wore his gun low and thought a loud mouth made him a man. "I heard a fella in town talking about a Calder," Jory continued, leaning back in his chair and looking around the room to ensure he had an audience. "Said there was a Calder gang used to run down in New Mexico territory. Bad bunch, robbed stages, burned out settlers. Said the leader was a cold-blooded killer named Luke." The room went quiet. The card game stopped. The only sound was the hiss of the fire in the stove and the wind rattling the door latch. Luke pulled the thread tight, knotting it efficiently. He set the stirrup down and looked up. His eyes were dark in the shadows of the brim of his hat, and the scar on his jaw seemed to stand out starkly against the firelight. Jory smirked, mistaking silence for fear. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Seems mighty coincidental." Luke stood up. He didn't move fast, but the suddenness of his rising made Jory flinch. Luke walked over to the stove to pour himself the last dregs of the coffee. He took a sip, the bitter liquid scalding his throat, before turning to face the boy. "That man is dead," Luke said softly. "Which one?" Jory pressed, though his confidence was wavering. "The killer? The man who rode that trail," Luke said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. "He died a long time ago, and you would be wise to let the dead rest. Boy, unless you were in a hurry to join them." He didn't make a threat. He didn't touch his gun. He simply let the weight of his history fill the room. There was a violence in his stillness that was far more terrifying than any shouted challenge. Jory swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the other men for support, but they were all suddenly very interested in their boots or their cards. "Just asking," Jory muttered, looking down. "No offense meant." Luke held his gaze for a heartbeat longer, then turned and walked back to his bunk. He lay down, pulling his blanket up, but he didn't sleep. He stared at the rough timber of the ceiling, listening to the wind, feeling the old ghosts gathering in the corners of the room. He could run to Wyoming. He could run to the ends of the earth. But the past had a way of riding double on his horse. 3 days later, Maggie Hayes drove her wagon into Dry Creek. The supply issue that had brought her to town was a simple one. The flour barrel was empty, and the winter wheat she had tried to grind herself had turned out gritty and bitter. She needed staples to get through the month. The town felt colder than usual, and not just because of the temperature. As she tied Nutmeg to the rail near the church, she saw a group of women gathering at the communal well. They were the wives of the town merchants and the church elders, women who wore their morality like armor. Maggie tried to ignore them, adjusting her bonnet and reaching for her basket, but the wind carried their voices clearly. "Hired on at the Boone place," one woman whispered, clutching her shawl. "My husband says he has eyes like a wolf. I heard he killed 3 men in Abilene." Another chimed in, her voice thrilled with scandal. "A dangerous drifter. It is a disgrace that Mr. Boone would bring such elements into our community." "He will bring trouble," a third voice said firmly. "Men like that always do. They are like a plague. Violence follows them." Maggie froze. Her hand rested on the weathered wood of the wagon wheel. A dangerous drifter, a man with tired eyes. She thought of the cowboy in the storm, the way he had steadied her horse, the gentle way he had spoken to her. Luke Calder. Was this who he was? A killer, a man with blood on his hands? She felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach, but beneath it, a stubborn refusal to believe the worst. The man who had shielded her from the wind had not been a wolf. He had been a shelter. She hurried past the women, keeping her head down. They fell silent as she passed, their eyes boring into her back, judging the widow who lived alone, the woman who was already a source of unease in their orderly lives. The errands took longer than she expected. The shipment at the general store had been delayed, and Mr. Henderson made her wait while he sorted through crates of dry goods for other, more important customers. By the time he finally weighed out her sacks of flour and cornmeal, the sun was dipping below the peaks of the western mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. Maggie hurried out of the store, struggling with a 50-pound sack of flour. She needed to get home. The road to the cabin was treacherous in the dark, and the wind was picking up again. "Mrs. Hayes." The voice stopped her. She turned to see Reverend Harlan standing on the boardwalk, his hands clasped behind his back. His face was shadowed, his expression severe. "Reverend," Maggie said, shifting the heavy weight in her arms. "I am in a hurry. It is nearly dark," Harlan observed, looking up at the sky. "Decent women are in their homes by now, preparing supper for their families. It is unseemly for you to be out on the street at this hour, alone." Maggie felt a flash of anger heat her cheeks. "I have a ranch to run. Reverend, I do not have the luxury of keeping bankers' hours." Harlan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You invite scrutiny, Margaret. You invite the wrong kind of attention. A woman without a husband's protection is a vulnerability to the moral fabric of the town. You should think on that." "I think on survival." "Reverend," Maggie snapped. She turned to lift the heavy sack into the wagon bed. Her arms were tired from chopping wood earlier that morning, and her boots slipped slightly in the mud. The sack was heavy, dead weight. She grunted with effort, trying to heave it up over the tailgate, but her strength failed her. The sack slipped from her grip. Before it could hit the mud, a pair of gloved hands caught it. "Allow me." The voice was low and familiar. Maggie looked up, startled, to see Luke Calder standing there. He lifted the 50-pound sack as if it were filled with feathers and set it gently into the back of the wagon. Luke. He didn't smile, but the harsh lines of his face softened as he looked at her. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, looks like you have a heavy load today." Maggie felt a rush of embarrassment, followed immediately by a wave of relief so profound it made her knees weak. She had been bracing herself to lift the second sack, dreading the strain. "Thank you," she said, her voice breathless. I lost my grip." Luke reached for the second sack of cornmeal on the boardwalk. He swung it up beside the flour. He moved with an easy, masculine grace that made Reverend Harlan, standing stiff and sour in his black coat, look like a scarecrow. Harlan's eyes narrowed. He looked from Maggie to Luke, his lips pursing in distaste. "So," he said, his voice dripping with ice, "this is the man I have heard about? The new hand at the bar S." Luke turned slowly to face the preacher. He didn't introduce himself. He just looked at Harlan with a flat, indifferent gaze. "And you must be the shepherd of this flock," Luke said. "Reverend Harlan," the preacher corrected. "And I know your kind. Mr. Calder. We want no trouble in Dry Creek." "Then don't make any," Luke replied. He turned his back on the Reverend, dismissing him completely, and turned his attention to Maggie. "This load needs to be tied down. The road is rough." He reached into the wagon bed to secure the canvas tarp over the sacks. Maggie moved to help him, reaching for the rope at the same moment. Their hands brushed. The contact was electric, even through the leather of his glove and the wool of her mitten. Maggie felt a shock that traveled straight up her arm and settled in her chest. It wasn't just warmth. It was a jolt of recognition. She yanked her hand back as if she had touched a hot stove. Her breath hitched. Luke froze. He looked at her, his hand hovering over the rope. For a second, the world narrowed down to the two of them, the smell of the flour dust, the sound of the wind, and the undeniable pull between two lonely people. His eyes held hers, and in them, she saw a fleeting softness, a vulnerability that contradicted everything the women at the well had whispered. "I have got it," he said, his voice rougher than before. He tied the knot quickly, his movements sharp. Maggie stood there, her cheeks burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified of what she had just felt. She was a widow. She was cursed. She had no business feeling a spark at the touch of a stranger's hand. Luke stepped back. "You best get moving. It will be dark in an hour." "Thank you," she whispered. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her hands trembling as she took the reins. Luke stood on the boardwalk, watching her. He didn't walk away until she had turned the corner and was out of sight. The ride home was long and fraught with tension. The sun vanished behind the mountains, leaving the plains bathed in a gray, spectral twilight. The temperature plummeted. Maggie huddled in her coat, the reins slick in her hands. She kept hearing the Reverend's words, unseemly, vulnerable, and balancing them against the memory of Luke's hand on hers. She was 3 miles from her cabin when the road dipped into a hollow filled with tumbled rocks and dry brush. The light was failing, shadows stretching long and distorted across the trail. Nutmeg's ears pricked forward. The mare snorted, her gait stuttering. Maggie tightened her grip. "Easy, girl. Almost home." Then she heard it. The dry, buzzing rattle that every Westerner knew in their bones. A rattlesnake, coiled in the warmth of a sun-baked rock near the wheel rut, struck out. It missed the horse's leg, but the sound was enough. Nutmeg screamed and bolted. The mare surged forward, tearing the reins from Maggie's slack grip. The wagon lurched violently to the left, the wheels slamming into a deep rut. Maggie was thrown sideways. She grabbed the edge of the seat, her legs swinging out over the void, the ground rushing by in a blur of gray dirt and rocks. "Whoa!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the thunder of hooves and the clatter of the wagon. The wagon was tipping. She could feel the center of gravity shifting, the right wheels lifting off the ground. She was going to flip. She was going to be crushed. Suddenly, the thunder of another set of hooves joined the chaos. Luke Calder burst out of the twilight, riding his big bay gelding at a dead gallop. He had been following her. He had stayed back, out of sight, riding guard in the darkness just in case. He pulled alongside the careening wagon, leaning perilously far out of his saddle. With a surge of effort, he grabbed the cheek piece of Nutmeg's bridle, hauling the panicked mare's head down and to the right. "Whoa!" His voice was a command, not a plea. He used the weight of his own horse to act as a brake, forcing the wagon to slow, forcing the wheels back down onto the earth with a bone-jarring thud. They skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust. Maggie sat frozen on the slanted seat, her chest heaving, her knuckles white where she gripped the rail. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Luke held the mare steady until the animal stopped trembling. Then he dismounted and walked back to the wagon. "Are you hit?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. Maggie shook her head, unable to speak. She felt tears pricking her eyes, tears of shock, of fear, of relief. Luke reached up and lifted her down. He didn't let go immediately this time. He held her by the arms, steadying her until her legs would hold her weight. "Snake?" he asked. Maggie nodded. I didn't see it. Hard to see anything in this light. He said, he looked back down the road. Then at her, "I told you the road was rough. You followed me," she said, her voice finding its strength. Luke looked away, adjusting his hat. "It is a free country, Mrs. Hayes. I was just riding this way. You were following me," she insisted, to make sure I was safe. Luke didn't deny it this time. He just looked at her, his face serious. A woman alone out here. Things happen. They finished the ride to her cabin in silence. Luke tying his horse to the back of the wagon and driving the team himself. When they pulled into her yard, the wind was howling down from the peaks, bitter and cutting. Maggie looked at the dark cabin, then at the man who had saved her life twice in 1 week. "It is freezing," she said. I have coffee on the stove. It would be a cold ride back to town without something warm in you." It was an invitation. It was a risk. In the eyes of the town, inviting a drifter into her home at night was a sin. But Maggie was cold, and she was tired of being afraid. Luke hesitated. He looked at the dark windows of the cabin, then at her. "I shouldn't, please," she said softly. "Just for a minute." He nodded once. Just for a minute. Inside, the cabin was cold. Maggie lit the oil lamp on the table and stirred the embers in the fireplace, adding kindling until the flames caught. The light pushed back the shadows, revealing the intimacy of her life. Luke stood by the door, hat in his hand. He seemed too big for the small room. He looked around, his eyes taking in the details with the same careful observation he used on the trail. He saw the table set for one, the lonely plate, the single fork. He saw the worn Bible on the mantel. His gaze lingered on a wooden chest in the corner. The lid was slightly ajar, revealing the edge of a soft, knitted blanket, pale yellow, a baby's blanket. He looked away quickly, a shadow crossing his face. He sensed the pain in the room, thick as the dust in the air. Maggie poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she kept on the hook. She handed him one. Her hands were still shaking slightly. "Thank you," she said, "for tonight, and for the flour." Luke took the cup, wrapping his cold hands around the warmth. "You don't have to thank me for being decent, Maggie. It is rare enough around here that I think I do," she replied. She sat at the table, motioning for him to take the chair opposite. He sat, moving stiffly. They drank in silence for a moment, the fire crackling. "You saw the blanket, didn't you?" Maggie asked suddenly. She didn't look at him. She stared into her coffee. Luke nodded slowly. "I did. It was for my daughter," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Sarah, we lost her 3 winters ago." The croup. It came on so fast. The snow was too deep to get the doctor. Luke didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't say it was God's will. He just listened, his silence a space for her grief to breathe. "Frank, my husband, he blamed me," Maggie whispered. "Said I let the fire go down. Said I was too weak to keep her warm. He never let me forget it. He died the next year. An accident in the barn. Folks say I caused that, too, that I carry death with me." She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "Maybe I do." Luke set his cup down. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "You don't carry death, Maggie," he said, his voice low and fierce. "You carry survival. There is a difference." He looked down at his own hands, turning them over to look at the calluses and the scars. "I had a brother," he said quietly. "Caleb. He was 18. Wild. Wanted to be a big man. He started running with the wrong crowd. My crowd. We were stealing horses down in Sonora." He paused, the memory obviously painful. "I told him to stay back. I told him it was a bad run. He didn't listen. The Rangers caught up to us near the border. I got away. Caleb. His horse went down. They didn't take him to trial. They hanged him from a cottonwood tree right there on the riverbank." Maggie gasped softly. "Luke, I could have gone back," Luke said, his voice cracking slightly. "I could have turned around and fought. Maybe I would have died, but I wouldn't have left him alone. I have lived with that every day since, the sound of that rope tightening." He looked up at her, his eyes raw and open. "We all carry ghosts. Maggie, it doesn't mean we are cursed. It just means we are still alive." The air in the cabin shifted. The shared pain created a bridge between them, a sudden, terrifying intimacy. The lantern light flickered, casting golden shadows across their faces. Luke reached across the table. He didn't touch her, but his hand rested inches from hers. Maggie felt the pull of him, the gravity of a man who understood the darkness because he had lived in it. She looked at his mouth. She saw the longing in his eyes, a hunger that matched her own. It would be so easy to reach out, to cross that small distance and find comfort in his arms, to let him hold her and chase away the cold that had settled in her bones 3 years ago. Desire crackled between them, sharp and sudden. Then panic set in. Maggie pulled back, scraping her chair against the floor. She stood up abruptly, her heart racing. This was too much, too fast. If she let him in, really let him in, and lost him too, she wouldn't survive it. "You should go," she said, her voice shaking. "Maggie," Luke started. "Standing up, please," she said, backing away toward the fireplace. "The town, if anyone sees your horse, please, Luke, you have to go." Luke stopped. He saw the fear in her eyes, the walls slamming back up. He respected them. He understood the need to protect oneself from hope. He picked up his hat. "All right," he said softly. "I am going." He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the latch, looking back at her. The urge to cross the room and kiss her, to prove that they didn't have to be alone, was a physical ache in his chest. But he wouldn't force it. He wouldn't be another man taking what wasn't freely given. "Good night, Maggie, good night," she whispered. He stepped out into the night, closing the door behind him. The wind hit him instantly, stripping away the warmth of the cabin. Luke walked to his horse, his body tight with frustration and longing. He mounted up and rode out, the darkness swallowing him whole. Inside, Maggie slid the bolt home. She leaned her forehead against the rough wood of the door, closing her eyes. "I cannot do this," she whispered to the empty room. "I cannot let another man in. I cannot lose anyone else." She stood there for a long time, listening to the fading hoofbeats of the only man who had ever looked at her and seen the truth. A half-hour later, another rider moved quietly along the ridge overlooking the cabin. Silas Boone sat on his expensive thoroughbred, wrapped in a heavy fur coat. He had been checking his fence line, or so he would tell anyone who asked. He stopped his horse, looking down at the cabin. He saw the fresh tracks in the snow-dusted mud, the distinct prints of a large horse. He knew Luke Calder's mount. Boone smiled in the darkness. It was a cold, calculating expression. "Well now," he murmured, stroking his horse's neck. "It seems the widow and the drifter have found a common interest." He looked at the small light burning in Maggie's window. He saw the vulnerability there. If he couldn't buy the land, and he couldn't scare her off it, perhaps he could use this new weakness against her. A woman in love was a woman who could be manipulated, and a man with a past like Calder's was easy to frame. Boone turned his horse back toward town, his mind already spinning the web that would trap them both. The wind howled across the plains, carrying the scent of snow and betrayal. The following Tuesday brought a deceptive calm to the high plains. The wind dropped to a whisper, and the sun shone with a brittle brightness that did nothing to warm the air. It was on this morning that Silas Boone rode out to the Hayes homestead. He did not come with hired guns or threats. Not yet. He came driving a buckboard loaded with sacks of high-grade grain, dressed in a suit of charcoal wool that cost more than Maggie's entire cabin. He pulled the team to a halt near the porch, tipping his beaver felt hat as Maggie stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," Boone called out, his voice smooth as oil on water. "I was passing by on my way to the north pasture and thought I might save you a trip to town. I noticed your feed stocks looked a mite low last time I rode past." Maggie stood on the bottom step, looking up at him. She did not smile. "Mr. Boone, that is generous of you, but I can purchase my own feed." "Nonsense," Boone said, climbing down. He signaled to the driver to unload 2 sacks. "Consider it a neighborly gesture. Us ranchers have to stick together out here. It is a hard country for anyone, let alone a woman on her own." He walked toward her, stopping at the fence line. He took a cigar from his pocket but did not light it, rolling it between his gloved fingers. "I have been thinking about your situation. Margaret, if I may call you that, Mrs. Hayes will do," she said evenly. "Of course, Mrs. Hayes." Boone leaned against the fence post, testing its stability. "This land, it is harsh, rocky soil, limited water. It broke your husband. Rest his soul. I hate to see it break you too. I am not broken yet, Mr. Boone." Boone smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. They remained cold, calculating, the color of wet slate. "Not yet, but the world is changing. I have heard word from Cheyenne. The Union Pacific surveyors are looking at the valley again. Civilization is coming. Mrs. Hayes, tracks, engines, noise. This quiet life you are clinging to, it is going to disappear under a cloud of coal smoke." He paused, gesturing to the vast emptiness around them. "I am a businessman. I am looking to expand my grazing rights before the prices jump. I am prepared to offer you a very fair price for this deed. Enough to set you up in a nice house in Denver or St. Louis. You could have servants. You could have warmth. You could leave all this struggle behind." Maggie looked at the sacks of grain, then back at the man who owned half the valley and wanted the rest. She knew what he was. She knew that civilization to Silas Boone meant control. "My husband is buried on that hill," Maggie said, pointing to a small rise behind the cabin. "My daughter is buried beside him. This land has taken everything I have loved. It owes me, Mr. Boone, and I intend to stay until I collect." Boone's smile vanished. The skin around his eyes tightened. "Sentiment is a luxury, Mrs. Hayes, and luxuries are expensive. You might find that holding onto a graveyard is a lonely business." "I am used to lonely," she replied. Boone stared at her for a long moment, reassessing. He had expected her to be desperate, grateful for a way out. Instead, he found iron. "Very well," he said, straightening his cuffs. "But keep the grain. You will need it. Winter is far from over." He climbed back into his wagon, the springs groaning under his weight. As he drove away, Maggie watched him. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the feeling of a predator circling, testing the wind, waiting for the right moment to strike. By Sunday, the atmosphere in Dry Creek had curdled. Gossip in a small town was faster than a telegraph and twice as destructive. It started in the saloon, drifted to the general store, and finally settled in the pews of the church. The whispers were not subtle. They hissed like steam escaping a valve. Did you see how he looked at her, helping her with the wagon, touching her hands? A widow and a drifter. It is unnatural. They say he goes out there at night. They say she lets him in. The rumors took the jagged pieces of Maggie's loneliness and Luke's isolation and cemented them together with malice. People who had never known a day of hunger or the crushing weight of grief found it easy to turn two people's pain into something dirty. When the church bell rang across the frost-covered roofs, Maggie walked into the sanctuary with her head high, though her stomach was twisted in knots. She took her usual seat in the back pew. The space around her remained empty. Mrs. Miller, who usually sat 2 rows ahead, pointedly gathered her skirts and moved to the other side of the aisle. Then the doors opened, and Luke Calder walked in. A ripple of silence went through the congregation. Cowboys and drifters rarely attended service, and certainly not ones with Luke's reputation. He had washed his shirt and brushed his coat. his hair slicked back with water. He held his hat in his hands, his eyes scanning the room until they found Maggie. He did not approach her. He did not nod. He simply took a seat on the bench nearest the door, isolating himself just as effectively as the town had isolated her. Reverend Harlan ascended the pulpit. He looked out over his flock, his gaze lingering on Maggie. Then, flicking to Luke, he opened the heavy Bible, the pages rustling in the silence. "Today," the Reverend boomed, his voice echoing off the rafters, "we speak of the sanctity of the home. We speak of the walls we build to keep sin at bay, and the weakness of the flesh that invites the devil in." Maggie stared at her hands, her knuckles white. She knew what was coming. "Scripture tells us to guard our hearts," Harlan continued, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "But what of those who leave the gate unlatched? What of the woman who wanders from the path of righteousness, guided by pride and loneliness?" He paced the small stage, working himself into a rhythm. "There are wolves in this world, men of violence, men who bear the mark of Cain, and there are those who would welcome these wolves, blinded by their own desires, forgetting their duty to God and their community. They mistake lust for comfort. They mistake the darkness for a friend." He never said her name. He didn't have to. Every eye in the room felt like a physical weight pressing against Maggie's spine. The air grew hot and stifling. She felt stripped naked, her grief and her private struggles paraded for entertainment. Luke sat like a statue. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was set so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He looked at the back of Maggie's head, seeing the way her shoulders hunched slightly, protecting herself from the blows of the sermon. "Woe to the tempter," Harlan shouted, slamming his hand on the pulpit. "And woe to the tempted, for they shall bring ruin upon themselves, and their neighbors shall suffer for their sin." When the service finally ended, Maggie bolted. She did not wait for the benediction to fully fade. She pushed through the heavy doors and out into the biting cold, desperate for air that didn't taste of judgment. She walked quickly down the boardwalk, her vision blurred. She just wanted to get to her wagon. She just wanted to go home. "Maggie." Luke's voice stopped her. She turned. He had followed her out, ignoring the glares of the deacons at the door. He stood in the middle of the street, the sun catching the silver concho on his hatband. He took a step toward her, his hand raised slightly, an open gesture. He wanted to tell her he was sorry. He wanted to tell her that the preacher was a fool and that she didn't deserve this. But before he could speak, 3 men stepped off the boardwalk, blocking his path. It was Jory, the young hand from the Boone Ranch, flanked by 2 burly older men who worked at the livery. They smelled of stale whiskey and self-righteousness. "Where do you think you are going?" "Calder," Jory sneered, his hand resting near his gun. Luke stopped. He looked at the men, then passed them to Maggie. She stood frozen near her wagon, her eyes wide with fear. "Just walking," Luke said, his voice low. "Walking toward the widow?" one of the livery men asked, spitting on the ground near Luke's boot. "You caused enough trouble in there. Why don't you ride on out of here before we decide you aren't welcome?" Luke looked at them. He could take them. He knew it with a cold, mathematical certainty. Jory was slow and stupid, and the other 2 were brawlers, not gunmen. He could drop all 3 of them in the dirt before they cleared leather. The old instinct flared, the red heat that had driven him in his youth, the violence that Boone had taunted him with. But then he looked at Maggie. She was shaking her head slightly, a silent plea. Don't. If he fought them, he proved the Reverend right. If he drew blood, he branded Maggie as the woman who consorted with a killer. He would be the wolf they claimed he was. Luke took a deep breath, forcing his hands to unclench. He opened them, showing his palms. "No weapon, no threat. I am not looking for a fight," Luke said. Jory laughed, emboldened by Luke's passivity. "Coward. That is what you are. A killer who lost his nerve." Luke didn't flinch at the insult. He held Jory's gaze for a long second, his eyes hard and flat. Then, deliberately, he turned his back on them. He looked at Maggie one last time, a look of apology and regret, and walked away. heading toward the hotel. The men jeered, calling him names, throwing insults at his retreating back. But Luke kept walking. Maggie watched him go, her heart twisting in her chest. She knew what it cost a man like that to walk away from a fight. He had swallowed his pride, his reputation, and his anger, all to spare her. It was the most chivalrous thing anyone had ever done for her, and it broke her heart because she knew she could not thank him. That evening, the sun set in a cauldron of red fire at the Bar S ranch house. Silas Boone sat behind a massive oak desk, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand. The room was warm, lined with books he never read and trophies of hunts he hadn't led. "Send him in," Boone called out. The door opened, and Luke Calder stepped inside. He held his hat in his hands, the brim turning slowly in his fingers. "You wanted to see me." "Mr. Boone, sit down. Calder, have a drink. I will stand, and I don't drink." Boone shrugged, sipping his whiskey. "Suit yourself. You are a hard man to figure. Luke, you take insults in the street like a whipped dog. Yet I have seen you break a stallion that killed 2 men. It is an interesting contradiction." Luke said nothing. He stared at the painting of a buffalo hunt hanging behind Boone's head. "I have a proposition for you," Boone said, leaning forward. "You are a good hand, better than most. I am looking to promote you. Foreman wages, $50 a month." Luke raised an eyebrow. "I have been here a week. I judge talent quickly." Boone set the glass down. "But the job comes with specific responsibilities." "Such as?" Boone picked up a paperweight, turning it over. "That widow, Mrs. Hayes, she is stubborn, obstinate. She is holding up progress for the whole valley. She trusts you, for some reason known only to the Almighty." Luke's posture stiffened imperceptibly. "What are you asking?" "I want you to talk to her," Boone said. "Make her see reason. Tell her the land is worthless. Tell her the railroad is going to take it anyway, which is a lie, but she doesn't know that. Convince her to sell to me. Do that, and there is a $100 bonus in it for you." Luke looked at the man. He saw the greed, the casual cruelty, the absolute certainty that everyone had a price. "And if she doesn't want to sell?" Luke asked quietly. "Then you make her want to," Boone said, his voice hardening. "You scare her. You tell her about the dangers of living alone. You let drop that you can't protect her forever. A woman like that, she just needs a strong hand to guide her. For her own good." Luke felt a cold rage settle in his gut. It was the same rage he had felt years ago when he rode with the gang, listening to men justify theft and murder as necessity. "No," Luke said. Boone paused. "Excuse me? I said no. I won't do it. She has suffered enough without me adding to it." Boone stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You are in a poor position to grow a conscience. Calder, do you think I didn't check into your background?" Boone opened a drawer and tossed a piece of paper onto the desk. It was a wanted poster, old, yellowed, but legible. It described a robbery in New Mexico. It mentioned the Calder gang. "Statute of limitations is a tricky thing in the territories," Boone said softly. "And judges. Well, judges are friends of mine. I could send a telegram to the marshal in Santa Fe. Have you in chains by the end of the week? Or you could do this small favor for me, and this paper goes into the fire." Luke looked at the poster. It was the shackle he had dragged for 5 years. He looked up at Boone, and his eyes were flint. "Send the telegram," Luke said. Boone blinked, surprised. "You heard me," Luke continued, his voice steady. "Send it. But I am not going to terrorize a woman just so you can run more cows. I am done with that life, and I am done with men like you." He turned and walked to the door. "You walk out that door. You are fired," Boone shouted, his composure cracking. "You are finished in this valley. Calder." Luke didn't stop. He walked out into the cool night air, the door slamming shut behind him. He was unemployed. He was threatened. He was likely a hunted man again. But as he looked up at the stars, he felt lighter than he had in years. The following week was a slow suffocation for Maggie. The shunning was absolute. When she went to the mercantile, "Mister, Henderson made her wait outside until every other customer had been served, and even then, he barely spoke to her. The blacksmith claimed he was too busy to fix the hinge on her gate, but the worst was the silence. She was walking down the boardwalk one afternoon when she saw little Sarah Miller, a girl of 5, playing with a rag doll. Sarah had always liked Maggie, often waving to her. Maggie managed a tired smile and started to raise her hand. "Sarah, Mrs." Miller swooped down like a hawk, grabbing the child's arm and yanking her back so hard the girl stumbled. "Don't you look at her." "Mrs." Miller hissed, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "You stay away from that woman. She is not for decent folk to know." Maggie lowered her hand. She felt the sting of tears, hot and humiliating. She walked back to her wagon, climbing up with trembling legs. She felt small. She felt like she was disappearing, eroding away like the sandstone in the wind. She drove home in a daze, the isolation pressing in on her chest until it was hard to breathe. That night, the temperature plummeted. The thermometer on the porch dropped to 10 degrees below zero. The wind came screaming down from the north, a blizzard wind that carried ice crystals sharp enough to cut skin. Maggie built the fire up high, feeding it the split pine logs she had labored over. The heat was the only thing keeping the cabin from becoming a tomb. She sat wrapped in 2 quilts, shivering, listening to the house groan under the assault. Then, a sound like a gunshot cracked through the room. Crack! A gust of wind, stronger than the rest, slammed into the chimney. The mortar, old and weakened by years of freeze and thaw, finally gave way. A stone near the top dislodged and fell inward, blocking the flue. Instantly, the draft reversed. Thick, black smoke billowed out of the fireplace, rolling into the room in a choking wave. Maggie coughed, springing from her chair. The smoke was blinding. It filled the small space in seconds, stinging her eyes, filling her throat with soot. Panic, primal and overwhelming, seized her. It wasn't just the smoke, it was the memory. The flickering orange light in the haze looked like the fever dreams she had suffered after losing the baby. The cold rushing in through the cracks felt like the death that had taken her daughter. The chaos was the same helplessness she had felt when Frank had locked her out, when she had pounded on the door begging to be let in while the snow buried her. "I can't breathe," she gasped, stumbling toward the door. She threw the latch and stumbled out into the snow, collapsing on the porch. The cold air hit her lungs like a knife, but it was oxygen. She coughed, retching, her eyes streaming. She looked back at the cabin. Smoke was pouring from the windows. She couldn't go back in, but if she stayed out here, without heat, she would freeze to death before morning. The wind was already cutting through her dress, numbing her fingers. She had to get help. She ran to the barn, her boots slipping on the ice. Nutmeg was nervous, smelling the smoke. Maggie didn't bother with a saddle. She threw a bridle on the mare, her fingers clumsy and stiff, and scrambled onto the horse's bare back. She rode for town. It was a ride of desperation, the wind tearing at her hair, the cold turning her tears to ice on her cheeks. She reached Dry Creek an hour later, half frozen. The town was dark, asleep. She rode straight to the livery stable, sliding off the horse and nearly falling when her numb legs refused to hold her. "Help!" she croaked, her voice ruined by the smoke. "Please!" The stable door creaked open. A lantern swung in the darkness. "Maggie?" It was Luke. He had been sleeping in the loft, having nowhere else to go after being fired. He wore his long johns and trousers, his feet bare on the straw-covered floor. He saw her state, the soot smeared on her face, the way she was shaking uncontrollably, and he dropped the lantern, rushing to catch her before she fell. He caught her in his arms, pulling her against his chest. She was like a block of ice. "My chimney," she gasped, clinging to him. "The smoke! I couldn't breathe! I can't go back!" Luke didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He yelled for the stable master, who came stumbling out of his room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Saddle my horse," Luke ordered, his voice cracking like a whip. "And get blankets. Now!" The stable master looked at them, the drifter holding the widow. "You shouldn't be getting involved. Calder, let her go to the hotel." "Do it!" Luke roared, the violence in his voice sending the man scrambling. 10 minutes later, they were riding back to the cabin. Luke rode double with her on his big bay, wrapping his heavy duster around both of them, his arms boxing her in against the wind. He rode hard, ignoring the treacherous footing. When they arrived, the cabin was dark, the fire having smothered itself. But the air inside was still thick and acrid. The temperature inside was dropping fast. Luke assessed the situation instantly. He saw the blocked flue. "I have to clear it," he said, "or we freeze." He went outside. The roof was covered in a sheet of ice. The wind was blowing 40 miles an hour. Luke found the ladder leaning against the shed. He propped it against the cabin wall. "Stay here," he told Maggie, who was huddled on the porch in the blankets he had brought. He climbed. The wood was slick. The wind tried to tear him from the rungs. When he reached the roof, he had to crawl on his hands and knees, digging his boots into the frozen shingles to keep from sliding off into the dark. Maggie watched from below, her heart in her throat. She saw his dark shape silhouetted against the stars, struggling against the gale. One slip, just one, and he would break his neck. "Luke, be careful!" she screamed, the wind snatching her words away. Luke reached the chimney. His hands were numb, devoid of feeling. He wrestled with the loose stones, leverage fighting against gravity. He shoved his arm down the flue, ignoring the searing heat of the trapped stones, and pushed. With a grinding crash, the blockage fell into the hearth below. "Clear!" he shouted. He scrambled back down, his body shaking from the exertion and the cold. When his boots hit the porch, he nearly collapsed. Maggie was there instantly. She pulled him inside the cabin. They left the door open for a minute to clear the last of the smoke, then slammed it shut against the night. Luke knelt by the fireplace, rebuilding the fire with shaking hands. The draw was working again. The smoke was sucked up the chimney, and the flames began to lick at the wood, casting a growing warmth into the room. He turned to face her. They were both covered in soot. Their eyes were red-rimmed. They were shivering violently. Luke stood up. The cabin was small, cramped. They were inches apart. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. Maggie looked at him. She saw the raw skin on his hands where the stone had scraped him. She saw the exhaustion in his face. She saw a man who had ridden into the freezing dark and climbed an icy roof just because she had asked. "I am alive," she whispered, "because of you." The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind something more potent. The air between them seemed to hum. The smell of wood smoke and wet wool was heavy. Luke looked at her, and his guard dropped. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her cheek. His thumb brushed away a smudge of soot. "I couldn't leave you," he said softly. "I tried to walk away. Maggie, God knows I tried, but I couldn't." Maggie leaned into his touch. For a second, she let herself feel it, the strength of him, the safety. She wanted to bury her face in his coat and never let go. She wanted to kiss him until the cold was just a memory. But then the fear returned, the sermon, the threats, the look in Boone's eyes. If he stayed, they would destroy him. They would hang him or shoot him, and it would be her fault. She was the curse. She pulled back, stepping away from his hand. "No," she said, her voice shaking. Luke froze. "Maggie? You have to stop," she said, hugging her arms around herself. "You have to stop coming here. You have to stop saving me." "Why?" Luke asked, pain flashing in his eyes. "Because they will kill you," she cried out, the tears finally spilling over. "Don't you see? They hate us. Luke, they hate me, and they will use you to hurt me. Boone, the Reverend, they won't stop." "I don't care about them," Luke said, taking a step toward her. "I do," Maggie shouted. "I care because I won't watch another man die because of me. I won't have your blood on my hands." Luke called her. "I can't bear it." She pointed to the door. "Go, please, if you care for me at all. Go. Save yourself, because I can't save you." Luke looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes. He heard the rejection, but he also heard the love beneath it. She wasn't sending him away because she didn't want him. She was sending him away because she did. It was a sacrifice. and it cut him deeper than any knife. He stood there for a long moment, the firelight dancing on his face. He wanted to argue. He wanted to fight. But he saw that she was near breaking point. Pushing her now would shatter her. He nodded slowly. "For your own good." He repeated her words, bitter and hollow. "Yes," she whispered. Luke picked up his hat. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "You are wrong, Maggie," he said softly. "You aren't a curse. You are the only good thing I have found in a long time." He walked out. Maggie stood in the center of the room, the warmth of the fire doing nothing to touch the ice in her heart. She listened to his horse ride away, and then she sank to her knees, burying her face in her hands, and wept until her throat was raw. Silas Boone did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, listening to the report of his ranch foreman. "He was there again?" Boone asked. "Yes, sir. Saw him ride out of the livery like his tail was on fire. Spent an hour at the widow's place. Just rode back into town now." Boone nodded, staring into the embers of his fireplace. "So," he mused, "the drifter has a spine after all, and the widow has a weakness." He stood up, walking to the window to look out at his land. "They are mocking me," he said quietly. "A washed-up gunman and a stubborn woman. They think they can stand against the future." He turned back to the foreman. "Get the boys ready. Tell them to bring torches." "But Mr. Boone." The foreman hesitated. "The law. I am the law in this valley," Boone snapped. "And it is time we'd finished this. If she won't sell the land, and she won't leave the land, then the land will have to become uninhabitable. And if Calder gets in the way, well, accidents happen in the dark." Boone smiled, a grim, final expression. "Tomorrow night," he said, "we pay the widow a visit she won't forget." The twilight settled over the basin like a bruise, purple and swollen with the promise of more snow. Maggie Hayes was in her yard, splitting the last of the kindling for the night, when she heard the heavy thud of hooves on the frozen earth. She straightened, the axe handle slick in her gloved grip. 2 riders were approaching from the direction of town, silhouetted against the dying light. They did not ride with the hurry of men on honest business. They rode slow, walking their horses right up to her fence line, blocking the gate. Maggie recognized the brands on the horses before she saw the faces. The Bar S, Silas Boone's men. One was a man she had seen leaning against the livery stable wall, a thick-necked brute named Stark with a beard like wire wool. The other was younger, thinner, with a nervous grin that showed too many gums. "Evening? Widow," Stark said, leaning forward on his saddle horn. His saddle creaked, the leather stiff in the cold. Maggie did not lower the axe. "What do you want?" "Just checking fences," Stark said, though his eyes were not on the perimeter wire. They were on her, Mr. Boone wanted us to make sure your property lines were secure, with all the trouble lately. Drifters and such. "My fences are fine," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "You can tell Mr. Boone I don't need his help," Stark chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. "Now, that is not neighborly. A woman out here all alone? You should be grateful someone is willing to look out for you. It gets mighty cold at night, mighty lonely." He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. The younger man followed suit, tethering his horse to her rail without asking. "You need to leave," Maggie said, taking a step back toward the porch. "You are trespassing." Stark unlatched the gate and walked through. He moved with the arrogance of a man who knew the law in this valley was bought and paid for. "We are just being friendly, Maggie," he said, using her given name like a dirty word. "Maybe you are too proud. Maybe you need a man to show you how to be appreciative." He lunged faster than a man his size should have been able to move. Maggie swung the axe, but it was a warning blow, clumsy with fear. Stark caught the handle, wrenching it from her grip and tossing it into the snow. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep through the wool of her coat. "Let go of me!" Maggie screamed, twisting violently. She kicked out, her boot connecting with his shin. Stark grunted but didn't let go. He yanked her closer, his breath smelling of chewing tobacco and rot. "You have got some fight in you," he sneered. I like that. Maggie clawed at his face, her fingernails raking 4 red lines down his cheek. Stark roared in pain and shoved her. The force of it sent her flying backward. She slipped on a patch of ice and went down hard, the air driven from her lungs as her back struck the frozen ground. The younger man, standing by the porch, laughed nervously. He picked up the oil lamp Maggie had left on the railing to light her work. She is a wild one. Stark, he said, tossing the lamp from hand to hand. Teach her a lesson. Stark growled, wiping blood from his cheek. Scare some sense into the bitch. The younger man grinned. He uncapped the lamp and poured the kerosene onto the wooden planks of the porch. The smell of fuel cut through the crisp air. He struck a match on his boot heel and flicked it. The fuel caught with a whoosh, a sheet of orange flame leaping up the dry timber. No! Maggie screamed, scrambling to her knees. The fire climbed the porch post in seconds, hungry and bright. The wind, ever present in the valley, caught the flames and whipped them toward the roof. Stark stood over her, grinning. That ought to warm you up, widow. Then the thunder arrived. It wasn't the sky. It was the sound of a horse being ridden to its death. Luke Calder came out of the darkness like a demon. He didn't slow down. He didn't shout a warning. He rode his big bay gelding straight through the open gate and into the yard, the horse's chest heaving, foam flying from its bit. Stark turned, reaching for his gun, but he was too slow. Luke launched himself from the saddle while the horse was still moving. He hit Stark with the force of a freight train, tackling him into the snow. The momentum carried them both rolling through the mud and ice. Luke came up on top. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need it. He grabbed Stark by the collar of his coat and drove his fist into the man's face. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound of bone cracking was louder than the crackle of the fire. Stark went limp, his nose shattered, blood pouring into the snow. Luke stood up, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. He turned toward the porch. The younger man stared at him, terrified. He dropped the empty lamp and scrambled for his horse. Fumbling with the reins, "Get out of here!" Luke roared, his voice terrifying in its raw fury. The boy managed to mount and spurred his horse, galloping into the night, leaving his partner unconscious in the drift. Luke didn't waste a second on them. He turned to Maggie. She was still on the ground, staring at the flames that were now licking at the eaves of her home. "Maggie, get up!" Luke shouted, grabbing her hand and hauling her to her feet. "We have to kill the fire!" The shock broke. Maggie looked at the house, her sanctuary, her prison, her home. Panic surged. But Luke was already moving. "Buckets!" he yelled. "Where are the buckets?" "By the shed!" Maggie cried. They ran. They grabbed the tin buckets and raced to the creek. The water was half frozen, a slurry of ice and mud. They smashed through the crust, plunging the buckets in, the water freezing their hands instantly. They formed a desperate line of 2. Maggie hauled the water up the bank, passing the heavy buckets to Luke, who ran to the porch and threw the water onto the flames. It hissed and steamed, white smoke billowing up to choke them. But the fire was established now, feeding on the dry wood of the walls. "Faster!" Luke yelled, throwing an empty bucket down and running back to her. They fought for an hour. It was a battle against the elements themselves. The wind fought them, fanning the sparks, driving the smoke into their eyes until they were blinded and weeping. The cold fought them, turning the spilled water on their clothes into sheets of ice. Maggie's arms screamed with agony. Her lungs burned. She slipped in the mud again and again, scrambling up, driven by the terror of losing everything. "One more," Luke gasped, hurling a bucket of slush onto the roof where the shingles were smoldering. Finally, the orange glare died down. The roaring flames subsided to a sullen, hissing steam. They stood in the yard, gasping for air. The porch was gone, a blackened skeleton of charred beams. The front wall of the cabin was scorched black, the window glass shattered by the heat. The door hung off its hinges, revealing the smoke-filled darkness inside. It was standing, but it was ruined. Maggie dropped her bucket. Her hands were raw, red and blistering from the combination of fire and ice. She walked slowly toward the cabin. Her furniture was soaked. The floor was a puddle of black sludge. The chest where she kept the baby blanket was untouched by fire, but the roof above it had leaked water and soot all over the room. It was broken. It was violated. Maggie stopped at the edge of the ruin. Her legs gave out. She sank into the mud and ash, not caring about the cold. A sound tore out of her throat, a ragged animal sob that carried all the grief of the last 3 years. Luke walked over to her. He was covered in soot, his knuckles bloody from the fight, his duster singed. He knelt in the slush beside her. He didn't speak. He unclasped his heavy canvas coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling the wool blanket from his saddle roll to cover them both. "Maggie," he said, his voice rough with smoke. "I have nothing," she wept, her body shaking so hard her teeth clicked together. "They took everything. They won." "No," Luke said firmly, pulling her against his chest. "You are alive. That means they lost." He looked at the cabin. Smoke was still curling from the wet wood. It wasn't safe. The structure was compromised, the air inside unbreathable, and Boone's men might come back when they realized Stark hadn't returned. "We can't stay here," Luke said. "I have nowhere to go." Maggie whispered into his shirt. "The town? They won't take me. I know a place." Luke said, "An old line shack up near the foothills. It is tight and it is rough, but it has 4 walls and a stove. And Boone won't look for us there tonight." He stood up, pulling her with him. She was dead weight, exhausted beyond measure. "Come on," he urged gently. They left Stark where he lay. The man was groaning now, alive but broken. Luke didn't spare him a glance. He lifted Maggie onto his horse, swinging up behind her. The ride was a nightmare. The wind had picked up, driving snow ahead of it. The temperature dropped until the air felt solid. Luke kept one arm around Maggie's waist, holding her upright, his other hand gripping the reins. She leaned back against him, her head on his shoulder, drifting in and out of consciousness. She could feel the heat of his body through their layers of wet clothes. It was the only thing anchoring her to the world. Coyotes yipped in the dark, sounding closer than usual. The emptiness of the plains felt vast and indifferent, a void that wanted to swallow them whole. "Stay with me, Maggie," Luke murmured against her ear. "Don't go to sleep." "I am cold," she mumbled. "So cold. I know. Almost there." It took 2 hours to reach the shack. It was little more than a pile of rocks and timber wedged into a cleft in the hillside, built by trappers or prospectors years ago and abandoned. Luke pulled the horse up to the leeward side of the shack. He slid off, his legs numb, and reached up to pull Maggie down. She fell into his arms, her legs unable to hold her. He carried her inside. The shack was freezing, smelling of dust and rat droppings, but it was out of the wind. Luke set Maggie down on the single narrow bunk built into the wall. "Don't move," he said. He worked with frantic desperation. He found some dry wood stacked in the corner, miraculously dry. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the match twice. He cursed, his voice tight with fear. Not for himself, but for her. If he couldn't get the fire started, she would have hypothermia within the hour. "Come on," he hissed. The third match caught. The kindling flared. Luke fed the fire carefully, nurturing the flame until the small cast-iron stove began to tick and ping with heat. He turned back to Maggie. She was sitting on the edge of the bunk, staring at nothing. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, her eyes hollow. Luke went to her. He knelt and began to unbutton her ruined, frozen coat. "We have to get these wet things off," he said, his voice professional, detached, though his heart was hammering. Maggie didn't fight him. She let him peel the sodden layers from her trembling body. When she was down to her chemise and petticoats, which were damp but not soaked, he took the blanket from his bedroll, the only dry thing they had, and wrapped it around her. He stripped off his own wet duster and shirt, shivering as the cold air hit his skin, and sat on the floor near the stove, feeding the fire. The warmth began to fill the small space. The wind howled outside, scratching at the door, but it couldn't get in. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle of wood and Maggie's shallow breathing. Then she spoke. He didn't just drink. Luke looked up. Maggie was staring at the fire, her eyes glassy. "Frank," she whispered. "He didn't just drink too much. He was mean. He liked it. He liked to see me afraid." Luke stayed silent, letting her purge the poison. The night Sarah died. Maggie's voice broke, then strengthened. "It wasn't an accident. I didn't let the fire go out. He came home drunk. He was angry about a steer he lost. He started breaking things. Sarah woke up crying. He told me to shut her up. When I couldn't, he threw us out." She turned her head to look at Luke, and the agony in her eyes was unbearable. He locked the door. "Luke," it was 20 below zero. "I pounded on the wood until my hands bled. I wrapped her in my coat. But the wind just went right through. By the time he passed out and I could break the window to get back in." She was cold. She was so cold. She shuddered, a full body spasm of grief. In the town, they looked at me at the funeral, and they whispered that I was a bad mother. And Frank stood there, playing the grieving father, and I couldn't say a word, because I knew if I spoke, he would kill me too. Luke closed his eyes. He felt a murderous rage, hotter than the fire, burning in his gut. He wished Frank Hayes were alive so he could kill him slowly. "I'm sorry," Luke said, his voice thick. "I'm so sorry. Maggie?" He looked down at his hands that had beaten a man tonight, hands that had done worse in the past. "I am no better," he said quietly. Maggie looked at him. "I didn't just ride with that gang," Luke confessed. "I wasn't just a bystander. I held the horses while they robbed the stages. I stood guard while they burned out homesteaders who wouldn't pay protection. I told myself I was just surviving. I told myself I wasn't pulling the trigger, so I wasn't guilty." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "My brother, Caleb. He looked up to me. He thought I was a king because I rode with Boone's kind of men. When the law caught us, I was the one who shouted for us to split up. I rode for the ridge. I told him to follow, but he was on a slow horse. I heard the shots. I kept riding." He swallowed hard, the shame tasting like ash in his mouth. "I let him die. Maggie, I ran to save my own skin, and I left him to hang. Boone was right. I am a coward. I have been running ever since, trying to find a place where I don't hear his voice calling my name." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of their shared brokenness. They were two people stripped down to their scars, hiding in a shack at the end of the world. The fire popped. The storm outside raged, dumping snow that would bury the trails by morning. There was only the one narrow bunk. The floor was hard dirt and freezing. Luke looked at the bunk. "You should try to sleep. Maggie, I will sit by the door. Keep watch." He started to stand up, intending to move to the cold draft of the entrance, to keep his distance, to honor the line he had drawn for her safety. "No," Maggie said. Luke stopped. "Don't go over there," she said, her voice trembling. "It is too cold, and I don't want to be alone. Not tonight." She shifted on the narrow mattress, pulling the blanket back to make space. "Sit with me," she asked. "Please." Luke hesitated. Every instinct of honor told him to refuse, but the look in her eyes, the desperate need for human warmth, for a shield against the dark, broke his resolve. He walked over and sat on the edge of the bunk. He kept his back to her, rigid, trying to be nothing more than a wall of heat. Maggie reached out. Her hand, warm now, touched his bare shoulder. She traced the line of an old scar on his back. Luke shuddered at the touch. "Lie down," she whispered. He turned and lay down beside her. The bunk was so narrow they had to lie on their sides, facing each other. He pulled the blanket up over them both. The darkness of the corner was intimate. The firelight played across Maggie's face, softening the lines of grief. She looked at him, at the scar on his jaw, the tiredness in his eyes, the strength of the mouth that had only ever spoken to her with kindness. Their knees touched. Their chests were inches apart. Luke could smell the smoke in her hair, But beneath it, he smelled her, lavender soap and rain. He could feel her heart beating against his chest. Or maybe it was his own. He looked into her eyes and saw the fear finally receding, replaced by something else, something that had been growing since the day in the dust storm. "Luke," she breathed. She moved closer, pressing her body against his. The contact was like a spark hitting dry powder. The heat of him seeped into her, chasing away the phantom cold of the winters she had endured alone. She realized suddenly that she wasn't afraid of him. She had spent years afraid of men, of their hands, of their anger. But Luke was different. He had ridden into fire for her. He had stopped when she asked him to stop. He had stayed when she asked him to stay. She reached up, her fingers sliding into the hair at the nape of his neck. "Maggie," Luke warned, his voice a low rumble. "If we do this, there is no going back. The town—" "Let them talk," Maggie interrupted. "Let them say what they want. They weren't here when the fire came. You were—" She pulled him closer, her breath hitching. "I have spent 3 years being cold. Luke, I have spent every night staring at that door, terrified. But tonight—" She looked deep into his slate-gray eyes, searching for the soul of the man beneath the scars. "I can't resist you anymore," she whispered. The confession hung in the air, fragile and absolute. Luke let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for a lifetime. The restraint he had worn like armor shattered. He didn't want to be the noble drifter anymore. He just wanted to be the man who loved her. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "Then don't," he murmured. He kissed her. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was desperate. It was the collision of 2 starving people finally finding sustenance. Maggie opened to him with a sob of relief, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him down. Luke held her as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning world. The storm outside meant nothing. The burnt cabin meant nothing. Silas Boone and his threats meant nothing. In the flickering light of the line shack, on a narrow bunk smelling of dust and sage, they tangled together. It was a reclaiming. Maggie claimed her body back from the memory of Frank's cruelty. Luke claimed his heart back from the guilt of his past. They moved with a frantic tenderness, skin against skin, the heat rising until it drove out the chill of the Wyoming winter. When Luke finally settled his weight over her, Maggie didn't flinch. She arched to meet him, whispering his name, anchoring herself to him. For the first time in years, she wasn't lonely. And as the fire died down to embers and the wind sang its mournful song over the hills, she knew that whatever happened when the sun rose, she would never go back to being the woman she was yesterday. She had chosen him, and he had chosen her. And in the Wild West, that was the only law that mattered. Dawn broke over the Wyoming territory like a gray slate cracked down the middle. There was no warmth in the sun that struggled to rise above the eastern ridge. Only a pale, bloodless light that revealed the world in all its harsh indifference. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt heavy, broken only by the snort of the horses tethered outside the line shack. They stood with their heads low, their coats frosted with ice, steam rising from their nostrils in rhythmic plumes. Inside the shack, the fire had burned down to a bed of sullen red coals. Maggie Hayes woke to the smell of wood smoke and the rough texture of the wool blanket against her cheek. For a moment, suspended between sleep and waking, she felt a profound sense of peace. She was warm. She was held. Luke's arm was draped over her waist, heavy and protective, his breathing slow and steady against her back. Then memory returned, sharp and cold. The fire, the attack, the ruin of her home. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket to her chest. The movement woke Luke. He was awake instantly. No grogginess. His hand instinctively moving toward the gun belt coiled on the floor beside the bunk before he realized where he was. He looked at her, his slate-gray eyes clearing as they focused on her face. "Morning," he said. His voice was rough with sleep and the smoke they had inhaled the night before. "Morning," Maggie whispered. She looked away, a sudden flush of heat rising in her cheeks. The intimacy of the night before, the desperate, claiming touches, the whispered confessions, felt almost dreamlike in the harsh light of day. Now, with the wind whistling through the chinks in the logs and their breath visible in the air, the reality of their situation crashed down on her. She was a widow who had slept with a drifter in the eyes of Dry Creek. She was now everything they had whispered she was. She pulled away slightly, wrapping her arms around her knees. Luke sat up. He didn't reach for her immediately. He watched her face, reading the shame and the fear that were trying to take root. Don't, he said quietly. Maggie looked at him. Don't what? Don't do that. Don't retreat into your head and tell yourself you made a mistake. I am scared, she admitted, her voice trembling. When we go back, everything will be different. You might regret. I don't regret a single second, Luke interrupted. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. He reached out, his hand covering hers. His skin was rough, calloused, and warm. I don't regret the fire, because it brought me here, and I certainly don't regret holding you. Do not insult me by thinking I take this lightly. Maggie, the conviction in his tone settled her heart. He wasn't pulling away. He wasn't looking at the door. We have to go back, she said, the weight of the day pressing on her. I have to see if there is anything left. Luke nodded grimly. He stood up, reaching for his boots. I will saddle the horses. The ride back to the homestead was a funeral procession of two. The land was buried under 6 inches of fresh snow, blindingly white, hiding the scars of the earth. But as they crested the final rise, the snow could not hide the black smudge that marred the valley floor. The cabin still stood, but it looked like a broken tooth. The porch was gone, reduced to a pile of wet, black charcoal. The front wall was scorched, the logs alligator-skinned and ugly. The smell hit them 50 yards out, the stench of wet ash and burnt pine. They rode into the yard. It was silent, stark. The man Luke had beaten was gone. The tracks of his horse were already filled with snow, but the depression in the drift where he had fallen was still visible, stained pink with blood. Maggie slid down from Luke's horse. Her legs felt weak. She walked toward the house, her boots crunching on the debris. The door was hanging by one hinge. She pushed it open and stepped inside. It was a wreck. The fire hadn't consumed the interior, but the smoke and the water had done their work. The walls were stained black. Her table was overturned. The floor was a slick of mud and soot. She walked to the corner where the cedar chest sat. The lid was open. The baby blanket, the pale yellow wool she had knitted with such hope, was gone. Stolen. Maggie felt a hollow ache in her chest that was too deep for tears. They hadn't just tried to burn her out. They had looted the few things that mattered. Luke came up behind her. He saw the empty chest. He swore softly, a harsh sound in the quiet room. We can fix the roof, he said, trying to find a foothold of hope. The walls are solid enough. I can cut timber for the porch. Before Maggie could answer, the sound of approaching riders cut through the air. Luke spun around, his hand dropping to his colt. Maggie moved to the doorway, stepping over the broken threshold. A group of 6 men was riding into the yard. At the head of them, on his tall thoroughbred, sat Silas Boone. He was dressed immaculately in a heavy buffalo hide coat, looking like a king surveying a conquered province. Beside him rode the town marshal, a man named Pike, who had a belly that strained his buttons and eyes that looked everywhere but at the law. Behind them were 4 of Boone's ranch hands. Boone pulled his horse up, looking at the charred ruin of the cabin with an expression of practiced shock. Good Lord, he said, his voice booming. Mrs. Hayes, we saw the smoke from the ridge. We came as fast as we could. Are you injured? Maggie stepped out onto the mud of the yard. She felt small and dirty in her soot-stained clothes, but she stood straight. You know I am not. Mr. Boone, she said coldly. Boone frowned, feigning confusion. I do not understand. We feared the worst. It is a tragedy. Truly, a fire in winter. It is a mercy you got out alive. It wasn't an accident, Luke said. He stepped out from the shadows of the doorway, moving to stand in front of Maggie. He stood with his feet apart, his thumb hooked in his gun belt, his body a barrier between the woman and the riders. Boone's eyes hardened as they landed on Luke. "Ah, the drifter. I might have known you would be here. Your men were here last night," Luke said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Two of them. Stark and the boy. They set the fire. They attacked Mrs. Hayes." Boone laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "That is a serious accusation. Calder, my men were in the bunkhouse all night, playing cards. I have a dozen witnesses. Perhaps you are confused. Or perhaps—" He looked at the burnt porch, then back at Luke. "Perhaps you fell asleep while you were keeping the widow company. A tipped lantern. Maybe. It happens when people are distracted by sin." The insult landed like a physical blow. One of the ranch hands behind Boone snickered. Luke took a step forward. "You are a liar. Boone, and a coward. You sent them to burn her out because she wouldn't sell—" "Marshal," Boone said, turning to the lawman. "Do you hear this? This man is slandering my name. And look at him. Look at the violence in his eyes. I told you he was dangerous." Marshal Pike shifted in his saddle, looking uncomfortable. He wiped his nose with a gloved hand. "Now, Calder, you settle down. You got no proof of any men being here." "I have the blood in the snow where I dropped one of them," Luke said, pointing to the drift. "Likely your own doing." Boone cut in smoothly. "We all know your history. Luke, a man who rode with the Calder gang, a man who was killed. It is far more likely you started this fire yourself to play the hero, or perhaps you tried to force yourself on Mrs. Hayes, and things got out of hand." Maggie stepped forward, her rage finally overriding her fear. "That is a lie. Luke saved me." "Your men—" She was cut off by the arrival of another buggy. It was Reverend Harlan, wrapped in a black coat, driving his small carriage. He had followed the posse, sensing a calamity. "What is happening here?" Harlan asked. Climbing down, he looked at the house, his face paling. "Dear God." "Tell them, Reverend," Maggie pleaded. "Tell them what kind of man Mr. Boone is—" Harlan looked at the burnt house, then at Boone, then at Maggie and Luke standing together in the mud. He saw the way Luke stood, protective, fierce. He saw the way Maggie looked at him. I see a house destroyed," Harlan said haltingly. "It is a judgment." "A judgment," Luke roared. "It is arson." "Reverend," Boone said, his voice smooth. "I was just telling Mrs. Hayes that this place is no longer safe. Look at it. It is a ruin. For her own safety. She should sign the deed over to me. I will give her a fair price, enough to buy a ticket out of this territory. It is the only Christian thing to do. She cannot live here, not after this." He gestured vaguely at the two of them, implying a filth that had nothing to do with soot. One of the cowboys behind Boone, a man with a scarred lip, leaned forward. "Reckon she won't be lonely anymore." "Though," the man sneered, "not with a warm bed warmer like Calder. Heard she likes it rough. Maybe that is why her husband—" The sentence was never finished. Luke moved. It was a blur of motion. He didn't draw his gun. He crossed the distance in 2 strides, reached up, and grabbed the cowboy by his coat. With a roar of effort, he yanked the man out of his saddle and threw him to the ground. The cowboy hit the mud hard. Luke was on him instantly, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening crunch. "Hey!" Boone shouted. Guns cleared leather. 3 of Boone's men drew their revolvers. Luke scrambled up, his hand hovering over his own weapon, but he was outgunned 3-1. "Hold it!" Marshal Pike yelled, finally drawing his own weapon and pointing it, not at Boone's men, but at Luke. "Stand down, Calder, or I will drop you where you stand." Luke froze. He looked at the barrels of the Colts leveled at him. His chest was heaving. The rage was pounding in his ears, demanding he draw, demanding he kill them all. But if he did, he would die, and Maggie would be left alone with them. He slowly raised his hands, palms open. "That is assault," Pike said, his voice shaking slightly. "I saw it. Unprovoked attack. He insulted her." Luke snarled. "Words ain't a crime. Hitting a man is, Pike retorted. Boone smiled. He had what he wanted. Marshal, arrest this man. He is a danger to the community. And look at the widow. She is clearly under his spell. Or perhaps she is just hysterical. Women get that way when they lose their homes. Reverend Harlan stepped forward, his hands fluttering. Marshal, surely there is no need for chains. The man was provoked. Stay out of this. Harlan, Boone snapped. Maggie looked at the scene. She saw the guns pointed at Luke. She saw the trap closing. They were going to take him away. They were going to lock him up. And then Boone would come back for the land. She felt the temptation to run, to sink into the earth, to let the shame silence her as it had for 3 years. But then she looked at Luke. He was standing with his hands up, a target for 3 guns, because he had defended her honor. He had walked into fire for her. He had offered to go to jail for her. Something inside Maggie Hayes broke, not like a branch snapping, but like a dam bursting. "No!" she screamed. The sound was so raw, so full of power, that everyone turned. Maggie walked past Luke. She walked right up to the nose of Marshal Pike's horse. She looked up at the lawman. Then she turned and looked at Boone. And finally, she looked at the Reverend and the few townsfolk who had followed the commotion and were watching from the road. Dr. Sullivan and the saloon owner. Mr. Black. "It is not hysteria," Maggie said, her voice ringing clear in the cold air. "And it is not a spell. It is the truth. And you are all going to listen to it." She pointed a shaking finger at Boone. "He sent men here last night. I saw them. I spoke to them. They told me to be grateful. They told me I needed a man to teach me a lesson. And when I fought back, they lit my porch on fire." She turned to the crowd, her eyes blazing. "You all whisper about me. You whisper about my husband. You say he died in strange circumstances. You say I am cold. Well, look at me." She tore open the collar of her coat, revealing the old, faint scar on her collarbone. A jagged white line. "Frank broke my collarbone 3 years ago because supper was cold." She said, "The doctor knows." He said it, Dr. Sullivan, an older man with a gray beard, looked down at his boots, then slowly nodded. I did set it." She said she fell. "But the break, it was consistent with a strike. He locked me out in the snow the night my daughter died." Maggie cried, the tears freezing on her cheeks, but her voice not wavering. "He stood at the window and watched while I begged to be let in to warm her. And you, all of you, you knew what he was. You heard the yelling. You saw the bruises on my arms at the market. And you looked away. You pretended it was none of your business because Frank was a man and I was just his property." The silence in the yard was absolute. The wind whistled through the burnt timbers of the cabin. "I am done being silent," Maggie said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I am done letting you shame me for surviving. Luke Calder is the only man who has ever stepped into this yard and offered me kindness instead of pain. He saved my life last night. He saved me from the fire you let burn." She turned to Reverend Harlan. "You talk about sin. Reverend, you talk about wolves. The wolves are right here, wearing fine coats and sitting on high horses. And the sin is yours, for watching a woman be destroyed and calling it God's will." Reverend Harlan looked as if he had been slapped. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked at Boone, seeing him for the first time not as a pillar of the church, but as a tyrant. Mr. Black, the saloon owner, spat into the snow. "She is right," he grunted. "I heard Frank brag about disciplining his mare and his wife in the same breath. We all knew." Boone's face turned a mottled red. "This is ridiculous. The woman is unhinged. She is protecting her lover." He pointed a gloved finger at Luke. "You think this speech changes anything? Calder, you are still a wanted man." Boone turned to the marshal. "Tell them, Pike, tell them about the Santa Fe job." Pike cleared his throat, looking nervous. We got a wire from New Mexico. Luke Calder is wanted for the robbery of the Wells Fargo shipment in '75 and the shooting of a deputy." A gasp went through the small crowd. Boone smiled triumphantly. "You see? He is a criminal, a killer. He is deceiving you all." Luke lowered his hand slowly. He didn't reach for his gun. He looked at Maggie, who was staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. Then he looked at the town. "It is true," Luke said. The admission hung in the air like smoke. "I rode with the gang," Luke said, his voice steady. "I was young and I was stupid. We robbed that stage, and when the shooting started, I fired back. A deputy took a bullet in the leg. I don't know if it was mine or someone else's. But I was there. I bear the guilt of it." He stepped forward, walking until he was standing next to Maggie again. "I can't change what I did," he said. "I have been running from it for 5 years. But I am not that man anymore. I am trying to live different. I am trying to stand for something. And right now, I am standing for her." He looked Boone in the eye. "You want to arrest me for the past? Fine, but you don't touch her. You don't touch this land," Boone sneered. "You are in no position to make demands. I'm in a position to tell the marshal that I will surrender peacefully." Luke said, "Or I can draw this iron. I might die. Boone, but I promise you, you will be the first one to hit the dirt. I don't miss." His hand hovered over his gun. The threat was real. The air crackled with tension. Luke Calder, the gunman, was offering them a choice: blood or justice. Marshal Pike looked at Boone, then at Luke's hand. He was a coward, and he knew a killer when he saw one. He didn't want to die for Silas Boone's ambition. "Hand over the gun," Pike said, his voice high and tight. "We will. We will sort this out in town." "Luke," Maggie whispered, grabbing his arm. "No, they will hang you." Luke looked down at her. His eyes were soft, heartbreakingly gentle. "It is the only way. Maggie, if I fight, we both lose. If I go, you are safe for now. The town has heard you. They are watching Boone now. He can't move against you with everyone looking. But I can't lose you," she sobbed. "You won't," he promised, though they both knew it was a fragile promise. Luke unbuckled his gun belt. He wrapped the leather around the holster and handed it to the marshal. "I am coming in," Luke said. "But if anything happens to her, if one hair on her head is harmed, no jail in this territory will hold me." Pike took the gun. "Get on your horse," he muttered. Luke mounted the bay. He looked at Maggie one last time, a look of longing and apology. Then he turned the horse and rode toward town, flanked by the marshal and Boone's men. Boone lingered for a moment. He looked at Maggie, who stood in the mud, tears freezing on her face. "This isn't over, Mrs. Hayes," Boone said softly. "The law will take care of him, and then we will discuss the land again." He rode away. The crowd dispersed slowly. "Doctor," Sullivan came up to Maggie, putting a hand on her shoulder. I will stop by later. Maggie, to check on you. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Maggie didn't answer. She watched the riders disappear over the ridge. She was alone, again. She walked back into the ruined cabin. The cold was seeping through the walls. She sat on the edge of the soot-stained bed. The temptation to run was a physical pull. She could pack the wagon. She could leave this cursed valley. She could go somewhere where no one knew her name, where no one knew about Frank or the fire or the drifter who had stolen her heart. It would be so easy to disappear. She looked at the empty space where Luke had stood. She remembered the way his arms had felt around her in the line shack. She remembered his voice saying, "I don't regret a single second." He had walked into a cell to protect her. He had given up his freedom so she could keep her home. If she ran now, his sacrifice meant nothing. Maggie wiped the tears from her face with the back of her dirty hand. She stood up. Her eyes fell on the heavy Sharps rifle hanging above the fireplace. The one thing the fire hadn't touched. The one thing the looters had missed in their haste. She reached up and took it down. It was heavy, smelling of gun oil and steel. She checked the breech. It was loaded. Maggie walked to the door and shoved it shut, jamming a piece of charred wood under it to wedge it closed. She wasn't going to run. She was going to wait. And if Boone came back, she wouldn't be the victim anymore. She would be the woman Luke Calder believed in. She sat in the chair facing the door, the rifle across her lap, and waited for the night. The wind that morning was a razor. stripping the warmth from the very stones of the street. Maggie Hayes did not feel it. She rode nutmeg down the center of Dry Creek's main thoroughfare, her spine as rigid as an iron rod. She wore her soot-stained coat, and her hair was pulled back severely, revealing the dark circles under her eyes, but her expression was one of terrifying calm. She was no longer the widow who scurried along the boardwalks hoping to be invisible. She was a woman who had walked through fire, and she had nothing left to lose. The town watched her pass. Shopkeepers paused in their sweeping. Women stopped their gossip at the corners. There was something in Maggie's demeanor that silenced them, a raw, dangerous dignity that demanded attention. She dismounted in front of the marshal's office and tied nutmeg to the rail. She marched up the steps and threw the door open. Inside, Marshal Pike sat with his feet on the desk, whittling a piece of cedar. He jumped when the door slammed against the wall. "Mrs. Hayes," he stammered, dropping his knife. "Now, you can't just barge in here. I want a hearing," Maggie said. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the room. Pike frowned, recovering his composure. "A hearing? For what? For the arson of my home, for the assault on my person, and for the false imprisonment of Luke Calder?" Pike scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "We went over this. Maggie, Calder is a wanted man, and your fire, well, accidents happen when emotions run high. It was not an accident," Maggie said, stepping closer. "And I am not leaving until you convene a hearing. I want the town to hear the truth. Unless, Marshal, you are afraid of what the truth might cost Silas Boone." Pike's face reddened. "Now you listen here. I believe," a voice came from the doorway, "that Mrs. Hayes has a right to be heard." Pike looked up. Reverend Harlan stood in the entrance, his black coat flapping in the wind. The preacher looked haggard, his eyes red-rimmed as if he hadn't slept. "You too, Reverend," Pike grumbled. "Justice is not a matter of convenience." "Marshal," Harlan said quietly, "if we are a community of laws and of God, then we cannot silence the grieving. Convene the hearing. Let her speak." Pike looked out the window. A crowd was gathering. People had seen Maggie march in. They had seen the Reverend follow. Curiosity, that most powerful of human instincts, was drawing them like moths to a flame. Pike knew he couldn't just throw her out now, not with half the town watching. "Fine," Pike spat, grabbing his hat. "But don't expect it to change anything. The law is the law." The town hall was a drafty barn of a building that smelled of sawdust and stale tobacco. By noon, it was packed. Every bench was full, and men stood lining the back walls. The air was thick with tension and the murmur of 100 low conversations. Luke sat at a small table near the front, his hands shackled to a heavy iron ring in the floor. He looked tired. A bruise blossomed purple across his cheekbone where he had been struck during the arrest, and his lip was split. When Maggie walked in, he straightened, his eyes locking onto hers. He didn't smile, but the look he gave her was enough to steady her trembling hands. Silas Boone sat on the other side of the aisle, looking bored. He cleaned his fingernails with a small penknife, occasionally whispering to the lawyer he had summoned from the county seat. Marshal Pike banged a gavel on the podium. "Order. Order in this hall." The room quieted. "We are here because Mrs. Hayes demands to make a statement regarding the events of yesterday," Pike announced, sounding as if he were reading a eulogy. "Mrs. Hayes, make it quick." Maggie stood up. She walked to the center of the room. She didn't look at the marshal. She looked at the crowd, the faces of her neighbors. She saw Mrs. Miller, who had pulled her daughter away. She saw Mr. Henderson, who made her wait for flour. 3 years ago, Maggie began, her voice clear and steady. "My husband, Frank Hayes, died. You all came to the funeral. You shook my hand. You told me it was a tragedy." She paused, letting the silence stretch. But it wasn't a tragedy. It was a relief. A gasp rippled through the room. "Frank Hayes was a monster," Maggie said. She unbuttoned the cuff of her sleeve and rolled it up, revealing a series of old, faded circular scars on her forearm. "Cigar burns. He did this because I forgot to mend a tear in his vest." She looked at Dr. Sullivan, who was sitting in the second row. "Doctor, you treated me the winter of '76. I told you I fell down the cellar stairs. Do you remember, Doctor? Sullivan stood up slowly, clutching his hat. I remember. Maggie, tell them, Maggie commanded. The doctor cleared his throat. The bruising was inconsistent with a fall. It looked like someone had taken a belt to her back. I suspected, but I didn't say anything. Frank was a powerful man. Thank you, Maggie said. She turned back to the crowd. You all knew. You heard the shouting. You saw the fear in my eyes. But you did nothing because it was easier to look away. And because you did nothing, my daughter died. The room was deathly silent now. Even Boone had stopped cleaning his nails. She didn't die of the croup because I was a bad mother, Maggie said, tears finally spilling over. Hot and fast. She died because Frank came home drunk and locked us out in a blizzard. He said he didn't want to hear her crying. We sat on the porch for 4 hours. By the time he passed out and I broke the window to get back in, her little hands were blue. She never woke up. Maggie wiped her face with the back of her hand, fierce and unashamed. I buried my baby, and I buried my husband, and I thought I was finally free. But then Mr. Boone decided he wanted my land. She pointed at Silas Boone. He threatened me. He tried to buy me out. And when I refused, he sent men to burn me out. 2 nights ago, 2 men came to my cabin. One was named Stark. The other was a boy I didn't know. They set fire to my porch while I was still inside. They told me I needed to learn a lesson. She turned to Luke. Luke Calder saw the fire. He didn't set it. He rode into the flames to pull me out. He saved my life while the rest of you slept in your warm beds. And now you have him in chains because he is the only man in this valley brave enough to stand up to a bully. Boone stood up, his chair scraping loudly. This is enough, he shouted. This is nothing but the hysterical ravings of a lonely woman who has been seduced by a criminal. I ain't so sure, a voice rumbled from the back. The crowd parted. It was the young man, the one who had been with Stark at the cabin. He looked terrified. He was twisting his hat in his hands. Boone glared at him. Shut your mouth. Jimmy, I can't do it, Mr. Boone, Jimmy stammered. Not with the preacher watching. My mama raised me better. Jimmy looked at the floor, his face burning. We was there, he whispered. Me and Stark, Mr. Boone said to scare her. He said to light a fire to make her run. It wasn't supposed to burn the whole house. It was an accident. A roar went up from the crowd. The tide was turning. The confession hung in the air. Undeniable. Boone's face turned purple. He strode into the center of the aisle, getting right in Jimmy's face. You are a liar, Boone screamed. You are drunk. I never gave such an order. He spun around, pointing a finger at Luke. This is his doing. He has turned you all against me. Look at him, a thief, a killer. He comes into my town, steals my workers, and then crawls into the bed of a pretty widow to hide from the law. He looked at Maggie with a sneer that was pure venom. Tell them, Maggie, tell them how good the drifter is between the sheets. Is that why you are protecting him? Because he gives you what you have been begging for? Luke stood up. The chain rattled violently. The insult was too much. The rage that Luke had been burying, the violence he had been trying to outrun, surged to the surface. His hands clenched into fists so tight the knuckles turned white. He took a step toward Boone, the iron ring in the floor groaning under the strain. Luke! Maggie's voice cut through the red haze. Luke stopped. He looked at her. Don't, she whispered, her eyes locking with his. Don't give him what he wants. You are better than him. Luke trembled. Every fiber of his being wanted to wrap the chain around Boone's throat and squeeze until the light went out. But he saw the plea in Maggie's eyes. She wasn't asking him to be a hero. She was asking him to be a man who could control himself. Luke took a deep breath. He forced his hands to open. He sat back down. Boone laughed nervously, seeing the threat recede. You see? An animal. Marshal Pike stood up, looking pale. He looked at the angry crowd. He looked at Jimmy, who was sobbing now. He looked at Boone, whose power was cracking like thin ice. I am dismissing the assault charges against Luke Calder, Pike announced, his voice shaking. "And Boone," someone shouted. "What about the arson?" Pike swallowed hard. I need more solid proof than the word of a frightened boy. Mister, Boone is a pillar of this community. We will investigate further. It was a coward's verdict. A stall." Pike walked over and unlocked Luke's cuffs. "You are free to go." "Calder, but I want you out of my town by sundown. If I see you here tomorrow, I will arrest you on the New Mexico warrant." Luke rubbed his wrists. He stood up and looked at Boone. "This isn't over," Luke said quietly. Boone smiled, a cold, shark-like expression. "No, it certainly isn't." Night fell like a hammer. The wind screamed across the plains, driving clouds of snow before it. Luke Calder did not leave town. He rode his horse out the south road, waited until he was out of sight, and then doubled back, cutting across the ridge toward Maggie's homestead. He knew Silas Boone. He knew a man like that didn't accept humiliation. Boone had lost face in front of the town. He had lost control. He would be coming to finish it. Luke rode hard, the freezing wind slicing through his coat, his heart pounding a rhythm of dread. At the homestead, Maggie sat in the darkened cabin. The air smelled of wet ash and fear. She had wedged the door shut with a heavy timber. The Sharp's rifle lay across her lap. She heard them coming long before she saw them, the muffled thud of hooves in the snow. She stood up, moving to the window. 4 riders. They stopped at the gate. "Maggie Hayes!" Boone's voice boomed out of the darkness. "Come out!" Maggie jacked the lever of the rifle. She stepped out through the broken door frame onto the scorched earth where her porch used to be. "Get off my land! Boone!" she shouted. Boone sat on his horse, flanked by 3 of his hardest men, gunmen he kept on payroll for range disputes. "I have a paper here," Boone called out, waving a document in the air. "A deed of sale, dated yesterday. It says you sold this land to me for $1. You forged it," Maggie cried. "Does it matter?" Boone laughed. "It is legal enough for the courts. Now, you can walk off this land, or my men can carry you off. I am not leaving." Maggie raised the rifle to her shoulder. One of Boone's men, a man named Dutch, raised his Winchester. "Drop it, widow!" The standoff held for a heartbeat, a fragile thread of time stretched to the breaking point. Then, thunder rolled from the darkness. Luke Calder rode into the yard from the flank, his Colt already in his hand. "Drop them!" Luke roared. Dutch panicked. He spun his horse and fired blindly toward Luke. The shot cracked through the cold air. The yard exploded into chaos. Horses reared, screaming. Maggie fired the Sharps, the heavy recoil slamming into her shoulder, the bullet kicking up dirt near Boone's horse. Luke spurred his bay into the melee. He fired, hitting Dutch in the shoulder, knocking him from the saddle. Another man fired back, the bullet grazing Luke's ribs, tearing through his coat and searing his skin like a hot poker. Luke grunted but didn't stop. He was a whirlwind of violence. The gunman he had tried to bury rising up to fight for the woman he loved. "Stop! In the name of God, stop!" A buggy came careening into the yard. It was Reverend Harlan. He had followed Boone, his conscience finally driving him to act. He stood up in the buggy, waving his arms. "This is murder!" Harlan screamed. "Boone, stop this madness! Boone!" His eyes wild with panic and rage, turned his revolver toward the distraction. "Shut up, you old fool!" Boone pulled the trigger. The shot hit the Reverend square in the chest. Harlan gasped, a look of profound surprise on his face, and toppled backward out of the buggy, landing in the snow with a dull thud. The gunshot echoed into a stunned silence. The 2 remaining hired guns lowered their weapons. They looked at the preacher lying in the blood-stained snow. They looked at Boone, who was staring at his smoking gun with horror. Shooting a drifter was one thing. Shooting a man of God was a damnation no one wanted a part of. I didn't mean," Boone stammered. "I am out," one of the men muttered. He holstered his gun and turned his horse. "I ain't hanging for this." The hired men scattered, riding hard into the night, leaving Boone alone. Boone looked around wildly. He saw Maggie standing with her rifle. He saw Luke, bleeding from his side, walking his horse toward him with a face like the angel of death. Boone kicked his horse, trying to run. Luke didn't shoot. He spurred his horse, closing the distance in 3 powerful strides. He launched himself from the saddle, tackling Boone. They hit the frozen ground hard. Boone scrambled, trying to bring his gun to bear, but Luke was younger, stronger, and driven by a righteous fury. Luke knocked the gun away. He grabbed Boone by the lapels of his expensive coat and slammed him into the mud. Luke drew his own Colt. He cocked the hammer. The click was loud and final. He pressed the barrel against Boone's forehead. "Please," Boone whimpered, his hands shaking. "Don't! I will give you money! I will give you anything!" Luke's finger tightened on the trigger. The rage was screaming in his blood. This man had terrorized Maggie. He had burned her home. He had killed the preacher. He deserved to die. It would be justice. It would be easy. Luke! Maggie was there. She put her hand on Luke's arm. Her touch was light, but it anchored him. "Luke, look at me." Luke tore his eyes away from Boone to look at her. His eyes were black with adrenaline. "Don't do it," Maggie whispered, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face. "He deserves it," Luke rasped. "I know," she said, "but if you kill him like this, in cold blood, you will never come back. You will be the man on that wanted poster forever. You will be chained to him." She squeezed his arm. "Choose me, Luke. Choose the life we can build. Don't choose the past. I need you whole. I don't need a killer." Luke looked at Boone, shivering in the mud. A pathetic, broken man. Then he looked at Maggie. He saw the future in her eyes. He saw a life where he didn't have to look over his shoulder. He let out a shuddering breath. The hammer of the Colt clicked back into place. Luke lowered the gun. He grabbed Boone by the collar and hauled him up. He spun him around and marched him to the fence post, using a length of rope from his saddle to tie the cattleman's hands behind his back. "You are going to jail." "Silas," Luke said, his voice void of emotion. "And this time, there is no buying your way out. You killed a preacher in front of witnesses. You are going to hang, but I am not going to be the one to drop the trap door." The sun rose on a changed world. Marshal Pike arrived an hour later, having been roused by the fleeing gunmen. He found Boone tied to the fence, weeping. He found the body of Reverend Harlan covered reverently with a blanket. He found Maggie and Luke sitting on the steps of the ruined cabin, holding hands. There was no bluster from Pike this time. He took Boone into custody without a word. The death of the Reverend had broken the town's fear of the cattlemen. Dry Creek would no longer turn a blind eye, but the victory felt hollow. 2 days later, Luke and Maggie stood in the yard. The wind was still cold, but the sky was a piercing, brilliant blue. The cabin was empty. They had sold the livestock. They had sold the tools. They had sold the land to a young couple from the east who didn't know the history of the soil, for enough money to buy a wagon and supplies. Luke checked the cinch on the pack horse. He winced slightly as the movement pulled at the bandage on his ribs, but he was healing. Maggie stood looking at the burnt shell of her home. She thought she would feel sad. Instead, she felt light, the ghosts of Frank, of the baby, of the lonely nights. They were staying here. She was leaving them behind. "You ready?" Luke asked, walking up to her. Maggie turned. She looked at him, the cowboy who had ridden out of the dust storm and saved her life. He looked different now. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet purpose. "I am ready," she said. "Where are we going?" she asked. As he helped her mount Nutmeg, Luke mounted his bay. He pointed west, toward the jagged line of the mountains. "I know a valley," he said. "Over the divide. There is a river that runs clear all year. The grass is tall, and the wind doesn't howl there. It sings." Maggie smiled. It was the first true smile that had touched her face in years. "Take me there," she said. They rode out of the yard, leaving the gate open. They rode past the town of Dry Creek, where people stopped to watch them go. Some looked away in shame. Some, like Dr. Sullivan, raised a hand in a silent farewell. They rode until the town was just a smudge of gray against the prairie. The road ahead was open. It was rough. There were no guarantees, The winter would still be cold, and the world would still be hard. But as they rode side by side, silhouettes against the raw western horizon, Maggie reached across the gap between their horses. Luke reached out and took her hand, their fingers interlaced, holding tight. They didn't look back. They rode on. Two survivors who had found the rarest treasure in the Wild West, a reason to keep going. The future was unwritten, and they would write it together. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust, the snow, and the fire of the American West. I hope Maggie and Luke's story of resilience and redemption resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the ending. Did they make the right choice to leave? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier, where the land is hard but the spirits are harder. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.